Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I felt a strange chill the first time I walked into that small house. This place was different. It was quiet in a way that made me uneasy. The landlord mentioned there was an attic but didn't say much else. When I asked why it was locked, he shrugged and told me it hadn't been opened in a long time. That was all he said. I decided right then that I wanted to see what was hidden up there. On my move-in day, I hauled boxes and small furniture inside. The house had one bedroom, one bathroom, and a little living room connected to a narrow kitchen. The walls looked worn, and the paint had cracks near the ceiling. A single window in the living room faced the street. When I stood in the center of the room, I noticed the faint outline of a hatched door on the ceiling, but it had a padlock dangling from an old latch. It looked ancient, with rust all over its surface. I reached up and tugged on it. It didn't budge. That night, I lay on my small couch after unpacking most of my stuff. I stared at that locked attic door. The landlord's vague attitude bothered me. Why wouldn't he explain what was up there? And why keep it locked if it was just a simple attic with nothing valuable? I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but my eyes drifted up every few seconds. I ended up sleeping there in the living room, dozing off with the TV volume turned low. The next morning, I couldn't ignore my curiosity. I decided to go buy a screwdriver. The local hardware store was about 5 blocks away. It was a hot, sunny day, and I remember sweating as I walked along the cracked sidewalks. The neighborhood felt old and a bit run down, with faded store signs and chipped paint on the houses. But something about it felt inviting too. It was quieter than I was used to. I found the store, picked out a sturdy flathead screwdriver, and headed back. When I got home, I climbed onto a chair and tried to pry the padlock open. The metal on the latch was brittle, and it made a grinding sound when I applied pressure. I spent a few minutes jiggling and prodding the tip of the screwdriver into the gap. Suddenly, the lock snapped open with a loud clank that echoed across the living room. My heart raced, and I felt a tiny surge of triumph. I pulled down the folding ladder attached to the hatch and climbed up. There was a musty smell right away, like old cardboard and stale air. The attic was darker than I expected. A single dusty window on the far side let in a dim beam of light. I flicked on the flashlight from my phone and scanned the space. I saw boxes stacked against the walls, all covered in thick layers of dust. Spider webs hung from the low rafters. I noticed a large shape leaning against one of the walls. It was a big mirror with an ornate metal frame. The glass looked old and there were smudges on it. I stepped closer and pointed my phone's light at it. My reflection looked cloudy and I couldn't see my face clearly. The floorboards creaked under my feet and I suddenly felt uneasy. I heard nothing else but my own breathing. I moved around a bit, checked a few boxes, but they were mostly empty. I didn't find anything unusual. After a few more minutes, I climbed down, closed the hatch, and locked it again. For the next couple of days, I focused on my normal routine. I organized my bedroom, set up my computer on a small desk, and found a decent spot for my TV. I had to adjust to the quieter atmosphere at night. In my old apartment, there was always some background noise. Here, everything went dead silent after 9. On the third night, I woke up to a sound directly above me. It was faint, like soft footsteps, or maybe something sliding across the floor. I sat up in bed and held my breath, trying to figure out what I was hearing. It lasted for about 10 seconds, then stopped. My heart was pounding, but after a while I calmed down and told myself I was probably imagining things. Maybe the house was settling or a branch was scraping the roof. But my gut told me it wasn't just the house settling. The next day, I decided to check the attic again. When I climbed up, I saw the same boxes, the same dusty window, and the same big mirror. But this time, I noticed faint marks on the mirror's surface. They looked like handprints or smudges in the shape of fingers. My first thought was that I might have touched it by accident when I was up here before. I rubbed the glass with an old rag and saw the marks disappear, leaving only streaks of dust. I didn't see anything else suspicious, so I locked the hatch and went back down. The noises didn't stop. They happened randomly, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. It always sounded like someone was walking in the attic. I'd jump out of bed, flip on the lights, and stare at the ceiling. My heart would pound, and I'd feel sweat forming on my forehead. Each time I told myself to stay calm and check. But every time I went up there, the attic was empty. No footprints, no signs of movement, and no clues. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping poorly. I'd wake up at the slightest sound. My shoulders felt tight and my stomach was uneasy. One morning after a restless night, I climbed up once more. My flashlight beam hit the mirror, and I noticed fresh marks. They were bigger and clearer, like two handprints pressed firmly against the glass. The shape of the fingers was almost perfect, and I could see where the dust had been pushed aside. I felt a jolt of fear. I wiped them off again, this time pressing my hand over them to compare the size. These handprints looked slightly larger than mine, and the finger spacing was different. That discovery made my pulse race. I started thinking about possible explanations. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe the landlord had a key to the house, or there was another way into the attic. It made no sense, though. Nothing else was disturbed. No boxes were moved, and nothing was missing from my room. I checked the doors and windows for signs of forced entry, but found none. A few nights later, I was watching TV around midnight. I heard the attic floorboards creak again, this time louder than before. It sounded like slow, deliberate steps above my head. My chest tightened. I muted the TV and listened. The steps continued for a few seconds, then there was a scratching noise. It reminded me of metal dragging against wood. I stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and climbed the ladder. My hand shook on the rung as I pulled myself up. I shined the light around. Everything was still. I walked toward the mirror and crouched in front of it. My reflection seemed off, but I couldn't figure out why. It looked like the glass was warped, or maybe the dust was creating an odd pattern. My breath felt shallow and I could hear my heartbeat. I tried tapping the mirror's surface, expecting it to rattle or shift, but it stayed in place. Then I heard a sudden thump behind me. I spun around, aiming my flashlight at the boxes, but I saw nothing move. The noise came from near the ladder. I hurried to check the area, but the attic was empty. My stomach felt tight, and my hands were clammy. I went back down, locked the hatch, and sat on my couch feeling on edge. Over the next few days, I became more determined to figure out what was happening. I examined every inch of the house, looking for hidden doors or gaps. I found none. I stayed up late with the lights off, waiting to hear the sounds. They came and went, always unpredictable. Sometimes they were faint, other times louder. My mind started to play tricks on me, but I tried to stay rational. One evening, I decided to record the attic sounds. I placed my phone on a chair in the living room and set it to record audio before I went to bed. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps above me again. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't move. I forced myself to stay still and let the phone record it. The sound stopped after a minute. The next day, I listened to the recording. I heard a soft creaking noise, and then a long scraping sound. It wasn't the house settling. It sounded too steady, too deliberate. My hair stood on end. I went up that afternoon, determined to inspect the mirror again. As soon as I shined my light on it, I saw new handprints, more defined than ever. The outlines were dark against the dusty glass, like someone had pressed their palms and dragged them downward. I felt a chill run through my arms. I tried cleaning them once more, but they left a faint residue behind. The mirror felt cold, colder than I expected. I decided to move it. I tried lifting it, but it was heavier than it looked. I managed to slide it a foot or two away from the wall. I wanted to see if there was anything behind it. I only found an empty space and old insulation. Nothing else. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in bed, imagining those handprints reappearing. My body felt tense, and I had trouble taking deep breaths. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a single loud thud from the attic. I jerked upright. My heart pounded and my mouth went dry. I got out of bed and stared at the hatch in the living room. It remained closed. I walked over to it, stood underneath, and listened. Nothing. I folded my arms and pressed my ear to the hatch. Silence. It felt like something was on the other side, waiting. I thought about leaving the house. I had no lease that forced me to stay for a long time. But something about this situation hooked me. I wanted to understand what was going on. I told myself I just needed more proof or some logical explanation. Still, the fear was real. My legs felt shaky every time I considered going up there alone at night. A few days later, I decided to check the attic in broad daylight. I felt safer with the sun shining through the windows. I grabbed a flashlight and a camera, hoping to document what I saw. I climbed the ladder slowly. The stale smell hit me again. I heard no noises, just the faint hum of traffic outside. I walked to the mirror and snapped a few pictures. I zoomed in on the glass and I could see faint smears, almost like fresh prints. My skin prickled and I felt cold sweat on my forehead. I muttered to myself that I would figure this out. I tried to stay in the attic for a while, thinking maybe I could catch whatever was making those noises. I waited near the hatch, shining my flashlight around whenever I heard a small creak. After about an hour, I gave up. The place stayed quiet. Nothing moved. I locked up and went back down. That night, everything changed. I woke up to loud footsteps above me around midnight. This time they were heavier, like someone pacing back and forth. I felt my heart hammering. I grabbed my flashlight and stood in the living room staring at the attic door. The footsteps continued. Then I heard that scraping sound again, but it was more intense, like something was being dragged across the entire attic floor. I felt a tightness in my chest. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I climbed the ladder slowly, every muscle tense. When I pushed open the hatch, the attic was dark. My flashlight beam shook with my trembling hand. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed. No reply. I climbed up fully, stepping onto the floorboards. I panned the light around the space. Nothing was moving. Then the beam landed on the mirror, and my stomach dropped. I saw two large handprints right in the center of the glass, bright and fresh. It looked like someone had just pressed their hands there. The dust around them was disturbed, and the outlines were crisp. My mind raced. There was no one else in the attic. I was alone. I felt my skin crawl. I took a step closer, sweat running down the sides of my face. The air felt thick and stale. My flashlight flickered for a moment and my heart nearly stopped. I tapped it to keep it on. Then I heard a faint scratching sound on the other side of the attic near the stacked boxes. I spun around, shining the light in that direction. The boxes were still, but the noise continued for a few more seconds before stopping. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I walked across the attic, checking between the boxes. No sign of anything. My nerves were shot. I knew I couldn't stay up there any longer. I rushed back to the hatch and climbed down. I latched it, then shoved a small metal rod through the latch to keep it extra secure. My entire body was shaking. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch with the lights on, staring at the ceiling. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but I couldn't relax. Now it's been almost 2 weeks of this. I still hear those noises at odd times. The mirror still shows new handprints whenever I check. I've taken photos, but they just look like smudges on glass. I can't prove anything is up there and I can't sleep well. I'm close to confronting the landlord. I want answers. Part of me wants to keep investigating. Part of me wants to run. But I'm not leaving until I understand what's going on in that attic. Something about this place refuses to let me rest. Until I get some clarity, I'll keep climbing those steps, even though my heart pounds every time I grab that flashlight and open the hatch. I don't know what I'll find, but I can't ignore it anymore. I got out of my car and felt a short burst of relief as I looked at the small summer house I had rented. I wanted peace and quiet. I wanted to escape from traffic and crowded sidewalks. I didn't expect anything strange. I saw a faded porch, a single rocking chair, and windows that looked a bit dusty. That was normal for a place that rarely saw visitors. When I opened the front door, I felt warm, stale air hit my face. It smelled like old furniture and slightly damp wood. I just shrugged and stepped inside with my bags. I placed them near a small couch in the living room and switched on the ceiling light. I saw a few pieces of simple furniture, a small coffee table, a couple of chairs, and a sofa with worn cushions. I was tired, so I decided to leave most of my unpacking for the next day. Then I noticed a radio on a shelf by the wall. It looked ancient. It had a chunky plastic exterior with a cracked handle on top. It was the kind of battery-powered radio you might have found decades ago. There was dust on the speaker grid. It looked like it hadn't been touched in a long time. I had no interest in it, so I left it there. I just wanted to rest. I opened a few windows to get some fresh air, then I dragged my suitcase to the bedroom. I saw a single bed, a small dresser, and an old standing lamp. Everything was simple and basic, which was exactly what I wanted. My first night went by quietly. I fell asleep early. I woke up around 3 a.m. for no reason. I got up to drink some water from the kitchen. It was dark, and the living room light was off. I noticed a faint glow coming from the radio on the shelf. That seemed impossible because I hadn't turned it on, and I hadn't even checked if it had batteries. I walked over and saw that the power light was on, and there was a low static hiss coming from the speaker. I flipped the power switch off. The noise stopped. I was still half asleep, but I felt a small knot in my stomach. I didn't think much of it. I went back to bed. The next morning, I examined the radio. It had old batteries inside, the kind that looked like they might have been there for years. I assumed the radio was faulty and maybe turned on by itself. I didn't throw it away because I didn't want to damage anything that belonged to the house. I just left it off. The rest of the day, I relaxed. I walked around the property. I sat on the porch and I read a paperback novel I had brought. That night I dozed off while watching some old rerun on the small TV in the living room. Sometime after midnight, I heard that static again. I opened my eyes and saw the radio light on in the darkness. The static was louder this time. It sounded rough, like something pressing against the speaker. I got up and turned it off again. I said, "This thing's busted," out loud. My voice echoed a bit in the stillness. My hands were slightly shaky, but I tried to dismiss it. I went to bed feeling tense. Over the next week, it happened every night. Around the same time, usually between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., the radio would switch on. Sometimes the volume was so low that I only realized it was on when I passed the living room. Other times, the static was loud enough to wake me up. One morning, I finally said to myself, "Enough." I opened the battery compartment and pulled out the batteries. They were corroded and nasty to the touch. I left them on the shelf next to the radio. The radio looked dead. I was sure it would stay that way. But the night after I removed the batteries, I was in bed again. I heard a click from the living room. I sat up and my heart started pounding. I walked out and saw that greenish power light shining faintly on the radio dial. It was on again, even though there were no batteries. The static was there, but it was broken up by these low voices. It was hard to tell what they were saying. It sounded like several people talking at once in hushed tones. I stood there in the dark, trying to figure out how that was possible. Then I reached for the radio. Right when my fingers touched the plastic, the station shifted. I heard a deep voice say something like, "He is ignoring the signs." I froze. It wasn't a normal broadcast. It felt like a direct statement about me. My neck tensed and a chill went through my arms. I switched the radio off, but my hand was shaking so much that I dropped it onto the shelf. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off it. That night, I barely slept. The following day, I tried to stay calm. I told myself there might be a logical explanation. Maybe the radio had some leftover charge or was picking up weird transmissions. I decided to stay up past midnight to see if I could catch it turning on. I sat in the living room with all the lights on. I had a cup of tea and tried to watch TV, but I couldn't focus on anything. My eyes kept drifting to the radio. Every tiny creak in the house made me jump. At around 2:30 a.m., I started to feel drowsy. My eyelids felt heavy and my head nodded a few times. I snapped awake when I heard a subtle scratch. I looked at the radio. The dial pointer moved a little, even though no one was touching it. I leaned forward and watched the pointer slide to the right on its own. The power light turned on. Then the static came through. At first, it was the usual crackle, but then I heard something that sounded like my name. It was faint, but I recognized the shape of the sound. Mike. My throat tightened. I turned off the switch and pulled the radio's plug out of the wall outlet. I had forgotten it could run on both batteries and AC. But I had already removed the batteries, so this meant it had just switched to AC power by itself. I didn't even remember plugging it in. That confused me and made me feel shaky. I left it unplugged and put it in a closet. I shut the door and told myself that was the end of it. I tried to continue with my vacation. I read more, cooked simple meals, and sat outside in the late afternoon. But something felt off every day after dark. I noticed small things. The air felt heavier at night. The house creaked more than usual. When I sat on the couch, I thought I heard faint clicking noises from the corner where the radio used to sit. It reminded me of someone slowly turning a dial. I'd look around and nothing would be there. I'd get up and check the closet, but the door was still closed. The radio was still inside. That didn't stop the feeling that something was close by, messing with it. One night around the middle of my second week, I was in the living room with the TV on low volume. I was lying on the couch, almost drifting off, when I heard the closet door squeak. I got up and saw that it was open. It wasn't wide open, just a few inches, but I was sure I had closed it. My heartbeat kicked into overdrive. I walked over and found the radio on the closet shelf. It was still unplugged, still without batteries. But the power light flickered once, then went dark again. I felt a surge of panic in my chest. My hands started to sweat and my mouth got dry. I slammed the closet door and stood there. My mind raced. I decided to lock that closet door if it had a lock. It did. I turned the small knob in the doorknob and tested it. It stayed shut. I tried to calm down. I drank a glass of water in the kitchen and watched the back door, expecting something else to happen. I kept seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye. I'd turn my head, and the shadows wouldn't match any furniture. Sometimes I thought I saw a shape standing near the radio's shelf, but when I blinked, it was just the edge of the couch or a curtain. My forehead felt cold. My arms were covered in goosebumps. I couldn't stop my mind from jumping to worst-case scenarios. But there was no one else around, and I didn't see any sign of forced entry. I told myself that I needed to hold it together. It was just me and some strange electrical fault. I tried to watch TV until I fell asleep, but every 10 minutes I'd jolt awake from a half-sleep, thinking I heard static. On the day before my planned departure, I decided to keep busy and be out of the house as much as possible. I took a drive to the nearest grocery store. I strolled around for a while, picked up random items, and avoided thinking about the radio. When I got back, I noticed a slight chill in the living room, even though the afternoon was warm. The house felt stale again, and the musty smell was stronger. I checked the thermostat, but it was set to a normal temperature. My nerves felt frayed. I switched on music from my phone to distract myself, and I started packing my things. I wanted to leave early the next morning. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a sandwich and a glass of water. I stared at the closet door, which was still locked. I felt this weird tension in my chest. After I ate, I moved to the couch. I turned on the TV to watch some random program. It was around 11 p.m. The house was dark except for the lamp next to me and the TV screen. At some point, the static started up again. I realized it wasn't coming from the TV because I had the volume low. It came from behind the closet door. It sounded muffled, but it was loud enough to hear through the door. I stood up and walked toward it. My legs felt weak and my breathing got shallow. I pressed my ear against the door. I heard a strange voice. It spoke in a low, distorted tone. It said a few words that sounded like my name again, followed by what seemed like incomplete phrases. He left. He closed. Must not. Then it stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, feeling sweat drip down my neck. I tried the door handle, but it was still locked. I backed away. The static faded. I waited in the living room, eyes on the closet. I felt an urge to run to my car and drive off, but I also felt stuck. After a few minutes, I slowly walked back to the closet with my hand shaking on the doorknob. I unlocked it and swung it open. The radio sat on the shelf. It was off. No static, no light. I touched it. It was cold and dusty. There was no sign of movement. I couldn't figure out how it had turned on or how that voice came through. My chest felt tight, and I took slow breaths to calm down. That was my final night. I ended up sleeping in short bursts. I left all the lights on. Every so often, I heard small clicking sounds in the living room, but I didn't get up to check. I just pulled the covers over my head and waited until morning. My alarm on my phone went off at 7 a.m., and I got up. I quickly grabbed my suitcase and the few items I had in the dresser. I felt anxious. I opened the front door to let in some sunlight. The living room looked the same as when I arrived, except for the sense that something was wrong. I stared at the shelf where the radio had been before I moved it. I got this slight feeling of nausea. My fingers were still twitchy when I grabbed my things and headed out. Before I left, I locked the front door. Then I realized I hadn't put the radio back where I found it. I hesitated, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. I felt like something was waiting for me to do that. I walked to my car, loaded my bags, and got in. As I drove away, I felt a shiver run up my spine. Even now, I can't shake the memory. I still hear static sometimes when I lie down to sleep in my own bed at home. I reach for my phone, turn it on, and check if there's any app playing white noise. There never is. My mind drifts back to that old radio. It turned on without batteries, repeated parts of conversations that I thought were about me, and made me feel watched. I don't have a real explanation. All I know is I'll never go back to that house. Even if someone paid me, I couldn't handle another night of that thing switching on and whispering my name in the dark. I just want to forget, but I don't think I ever will. Sometimes when the sun goes down, I still feel that knot in my stomach. I remember that voice, and I remember how the radio dial moved on its own. That's enough to keep me up at night. I'm done with summer rentals. I'd rather stay home, even if it means dealing with the noise of the city. At least that noise is normal. Static and low voices at 3 in the morning are not. They stay with you. They get under your skin. I can't ignore it anymore. That house gave me more than just a bad vacation. It made me question every strange sound I hear when I'm alone. And that's a feeling I can't shake, no matter how many nights go by. I moved in on a Thursday afternoon. The building looked old from the outside, with chipped paint around the windows and a rusty fire escape bolted to the side. I walked into the lobby carrying 2 boxes of kitchenware. The floor tiles were cracked, and there was a musty smell that reminded me of damp clothes. I saw a small stack of envelopes piled near a row of mailboxes. All of them were addressed to a guy named Marcos. I brushed it off at first. People get mail after they move out. But something about that stack made me pause. It looked like it had been there for a while. The edges of the envelopes were curled and yellowish. Still, I was focused on settling in. I grabbed my keys from my pocket and headed up the stairs to the 3rd floor. When I got to my new door, I noticed fresh scuff marks on the threshold. They looked like heavy shoes or boots had been dragged there. I didn't think too much about it. I set my boxes down, fit the key into the lock, and entered the apartment. Inside, it felt stale. The air was heavier than in the hallway. The living room had an old sofa, a wooden coffee table, and a few dusty shelves. The kitchen was small, with an outdated refrigerator and an electric stove that had dents on the sides. I remember checking the cabinets and noticing a few cans of food left behind. They were expired. I tossed them out. A bit later, I ran into a woman named Dona Vera. She lived across the hall. She was short with curly hair and a cautious expression. She saw me lugging another box in and asked if I was the new tenant. I said yes. She looked at the envelopes in my hand and frowned. Then she told me that the previous tenant had left in a hurry. He just vanished, she said. Left most of his things here and took off one night. We never saw him again, not even a goodbye. Her voice shook a bit. I asked if she knew where he went. She said no. She added that he never mentioned travel plans and he never hired a moving truck. He didn't even bother to change his address. I shrugged it off at the time. I had other things on my mind. I wanted to unpack and set up my bed. I spent the rest of the evening sorting out my clothes and trying to ignore a faint creaking sound that kept coming from the living room. I figured it was just the building settling. I was tired and tried to sleep early. The first night was quiet, but I remember feeling restless. My mattress was on the floor because I hadn't finished assembling the bed frame. At around 2 a.m., I heard the sink in the bathroom drip. It wasn't a big deal, so I just turned over and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I got up and found the bathroom faucet dripping more than before. I twisted the knob tight and it stopped. I noticed a faint scent of men's cologne in the bathroom. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't the kind that had been left on the shelves. I sniffed around, then checked the ventilation. I assumed it might be coming from another apartment. The walls were thin, and I could hear water pipes running from upstairs whenever someone showered. After I brushed my teeth, I walked into the living room. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. My keys were still on the kitchen counter. I felt a jolt in my stomach, but I reasoned that maybe I had forgotten to turn the deadbolt. I made a note to be extra careful. During the next few days, small things kept happening. I saw faint footprints in the dusty hallway by the bedrooms. They weren't mine. My shoe size is different, and I recognized the shape as something else entirely. The footprints led partway down the hall and then disappeared. I started to question myself. Was I tracking dust around without realizing it? I checked the soles of my shoes. They were clean because I usually wipe them on the doormat outside. Also, the footprints were bigger, maybe a size or two larger than mine. On the third night, I woke up around 1 a.m. to the sound of water dripping again. It wasn't just a drip this time. I heard a brief flow of running water like someone had turned on the tap for a few seconds. I sat up. My heart was beating fast. I got out of bed, grabbed my phone, and walked carefully to the bathroom. The door was shut. I gently pushed it open. The light was off, but I smelled that same cologne. It was stronger now. When I flicked on the light, the sink was wet, and the faucet was dripping. I turned it off and wiped the counter with a towel. Then I heard a faint tap, tap, tap in the hallway. It sounded like wet footsteps on the floor. I followed the sound. Phone flashlight pointed forward. I saw small puddles of water leading out of the bathroom, down the hall, and into the living room. They stopped near the front of the sofa. When I checked the floor at that spot, the water had vanished. The wood wasn't damp, and there was no trail beyond that point. My hands were shaking a bit and my stomach was tight. I felt exposed in my own place. I checked the front door. It was still locked. I stood there for a good minute, holding the doorknob, breathing fast. Eventually, I forced myself back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The next day, I tried talking to another neighbor, a middle-aged man named Jorge. I asked if he remembered the guy who used to live in my apartment. He said he barely spoke to him, but he recalled loud arguments through the walls. Jorge said Marcos would talk on the phone for hours, sometimes yelling. Then, one night, everything went quiet. Jorge assumed the guy moved out. He didn't know anything else. I asked if anyone ever came looking for Marcos. He said no. I left with more questions. I started checking the hallway each morning, hoping to see any clue. The stack of mail grew. Some of it had late payment notices. Some had generic ads. I recognized the last name from the envelopes, which matched the name on some leftover magazines inside my apartment. It looked like he subscribed to a health and fitness monthly. The covers had pictures of bodybuilders. It matched the idea of a physically strong man. I wondered if he had left in fear or if something else had happened. Almost a week passed. Each night I heard the drip in the bathroom. Sometimes I smelled cologne, sometimes I didn't. I'd wake up with a jolt because I felt like someone was standing over my bed or sitting on the edge. I never saw anyone. One night, I was half asleep and rolled over, and I swear I felt another body next to me. There was an indentation in the mattress that made me slide a bit toward it. I froze, my skin crawled, and my heart pounded. I reached out my hand, expecting to touch something solid, but there was only empty air. The dent in the mattress stayed for a few seconds, then rose back up like there had been pressure there. I couldn't explain it. I started sleeping with the bedroom light on. I wasn't able to rest well. My eyes were red in the morning and I felt jumpy. I double-checked the locks every night. Still, I'd wake up and find the door unlocked or slightly open. At one point, I worried maybe I was sleepwalking, so I stacked a few boxes in front of the door to see if they'd be moved. The next day, the boxes were moved to the side, and the door was open. I had no memory of doing that. I called the landlord and asked if there was a spare key floating around. He said no, just the main set that Marcos had, which was never returned. I asked if Marcos had come back for anything. The landlord sounded confused. He didn't know about any official move-out. He just assumed rent payments would eventually stop. He was behind on paperwork and said he never checked. He apologized for the inconvenience and told me he would change the locks if I was worried. I felt some relief. I scheduled a lock change for the following week. Before that happened, one last event pushed me to the edge. It was around 3 a.m. I was lying in bed, forcing myself to keep my eyes shut. The faucet in the bathroom dripped, then stopped. Then the bedroom door hinges squeaked. I stayed still, hoping I was imagining it. But I heard a faint shuffle on the floor. It was slow, like someone was stepping carefully to avoid making noise. My heart was racing, my arms felt cold. I opened my eyes a bit, just enough to see a shadow across the room. There was nothing there, but I sensed movement. Then I felt weight on the mattress again. It dipped on the other side as though a heavy body sat down. My breath caught in my throat. I broke into a sweat. I couldn't move. My whole chest was tight. I heard a faint exhale like someone breathing out. My eyes watered. I squeezed them shut and tried to will it away. After a minute or so, the pressure on the mattress lifted. I heard a soft sound like footsteps crossing the room. The bedroom door squeaked again. I threw off the blanket and ran to the light switch. The room was empty. I glanced at the clock on my phone. It was 3:07 a.m. I felt the door handle. It was damp, like someone with wet hands had gripped it. I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I stood in the doorway, straining my ears. I heard nothing. I walked over to the living room. The front door was still shut, but it wasn't locked. I locked it, then paced around. I didn't bother trying to sleep again. I sat on the couch, checking every corner every few minutes. The lock change happened 2 days later. The locksmith replaced everything, and I felt safer for about a week. The dripping faucet stopped on its own, which was odd. The cologne smell faded. I thought maybe the weirdness was over. Then I noticed the footprints again, this time leading from the hallway to my bedroom door. They were faint, but they were there. On a Friday night, I came home late after meeting some co-workers for drinks. I was sober enough to notice details. The second I opened the door, I sensed a cold spot in the living room. It felt like entering a room with the air conditioner on full blast, except I didn't have an air conditioner. The cold spot moved. I walked around trying to figure out if there was a draft. The windows were all closed. That night I woke up to a loud thump near my bed. I bolted upright, chest pounding. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I saw the mattress indentation again, only this time it looked deeper, as if someone heavier was pressing it down. I couldn't handle it. My body went rigid. My hands trembled. I crawled off the bed, keeping my eyes on that spot. It slowly rose back up. I heard a short, shallow breath right behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight everywhere. I saw nothing. By morning, the door was unlocked again. I walked out into the hall feeling exhausted. I saw more mail for Marcos. It felt like an insult. He wasn't coming back, but something about him was still here. I couldn't shake the idea that he never really left. I decided I wasn't going to put up with it anymore. That same day, I packed up my belongings as fast as I could. I told the landlord I was leaving. I didn't care about breaking the lease. I just wanted out. I moved out that afternoon. I left the keys on the kitchen counter. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I got my boxes into my car, slammed the trunk shut, and drove away. My chest felt tight until I was at least a mile from the building. When I finally looked at the rearview mirror, I let out a breath I'd been holding in. I never went back for the security deposit. I didn't care. That's all I know. Marcos never showed up while I was there, but there was something in that apartment. I don't have a name for it. I'm not sure if it was him or something else. I just know I couldn't live with that presence anymore. I still think about the footprints and the smell of cologne. I think about the door unlocking at night. I hate the memory of lying in bed and feeling that shift on the mattress like I wasn't alone. I've tried to put it out of my head, but sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and expect to see those footprints again. I haven't told many people about this because it sounds ridiculous, but I lived it, and it still feels real to me, and that's all there is to say. I never planned to spend a night in that remote place. My trip was supposed to be straightforward: drive to the city, meet a few clients, and head back home in time for dinner. But a breakdown on the highway changed everything. My car's engine started sputtering, and it wouldn't hold a steady speed. I got stuck in the middle of nowhere with the closest town miles behind me. After a few frantic phone calls, I realized I had no choice. I saw an old sign for a rural inn up the road, so I decided to check if they had a room. It was late and I was tired. I just wanted a bed and a quick fix in the morning. When I pulled into the driveway, I felt a wave of relief. The place looked old, but the lights were on. The building was a single-story structure with a small second floor in the back. The walls were made of wood, and the paint was chipped. There was a wooden sign that read, "Lakeview Inn," even though I didn't see any lake. I was too exhausted to care about that. I walked up to the door, my overnight bag in one hand and my car keys in the other. Inside, the front lobby was dimly lit. The floorboards creaked with every step. There was an old reception desk that looked like it had been around for decades. I rang a small bell on the counter, and after a moment, a tall man in his 60s came out of a back room. He wore a flannel shirt and looked me over, probably curious about who would show up at this hour. He gave me a friendly greeting, and I told him I was there for work, but my car had problems. I asked if there was a room available for the night. He said yes, and he seemed happy to have a guest. He led me down a narrow hallway with a few doors on each side. Everything smelled a bit musty, like old furniture and stale air. He opened the door to a small room at the end of the hall. Inside, there was a single bed with a thick wooden frame, a small desk, and a dresser. The furniture looked antique, with scratches along the edges. There was a small window facing what seemed like open fields. I noticed a painting on the wall of a barn, and I remember thinking how dull and gray it looked. The man handed me a key, told me there was a shared bathroom next door, and reminded me that breakfast would be ready at 7 if I wanted it. Then he left, closing the door gently behind him. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt the springs push back against me. I was drained. I changed into comfortable clothes, brushed my teeth in the shared bathroom, and came back to my room. I turned off the lights and lay down. The sheets smelled clean, but the blanket felt coarse. I tried to ignore it. I just needed to sleep. After some tossing and turning, I was on the edge of drifting off when I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were loud, heavy steps. They moved up and down, slow and deliberate. At first, I assumed it was the owner checking something. Maybe he was carrying supplies or just pacing around, but the sound didn't stop. It kept going back and forth. I glanced at my phone. It was nearly 3 a.m. The footsteps seemed too steady for someone just heading to the bathroom. They went from one end of the hall to the other and back again. I thought about getting up to see what was going on, but I was exhausted. and I didn't want to intrude on the owner's business. I figured it might be a quirk of the place. Maybe the man had a habit of walking at night. I tried covering my ears with the pillow. That helped a bit, but I could still hear the creaks in the floorboards. Then I heard the footsteps stop right outside my door. The floor made a sharp creak, and I felt a jolt of anxiety. I stared at the door. My heart started pounding. It was a tight, anxious feeling in my chest. The doorknob turned. The metal made a clicking sound. My mind froze. The door didn't open all the way, but I saw a faint glow from the hallway light spilling into the room. I gripped the edges of my blanket. The door stayed half open for a few seconds. I expected someone to step inside, but nothing happened. Then the door closed again, very softly. I heard the click of the latch. The footsteps continued down the hall, and then everything went silent. I lay there in the dark, wide-eyed, staring at the door. My breathing was shallow, and I was sweating. My mind raced. Was the owner checking on me? Did he forget something? Why would he just open my door like that? I debated getting up and talking to him, but I felt an uneasy vibe. I decided to wait until morning. After another hour of restless thoughts, I somehow dozed off. The next morning, I woke up stiff and uncomfortable. The sun was shining through the small window, and I realized I had slept later than usual. I checked my phone. It was 8:15 a.m. I got up, changed into my work clothes, and went to find the owner. I found him by the front desk, sipping coffee and flipping through a magazine. I asked if he needed something during the night. I described the footsteps and mentioned someone opening my door. He looked at me with genuine surprise and said he had gone to bed around midnight. He insisted he hadn't walked around at all. I felt a chill in my stomach. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained how loud the footsteps were. He shrugged, apologized, and said it might have been the building settling or something else. I knew that didn't make sense. That building had a clear hallway with squeaky floorboards. Something was up, but I didn't push him. I just wanted to get my car fixed and leave as soon as possible. He directed me to a small garage about 10 miles away, so I drove there slowly, worried my car might break down again. The mechanic said he would need a few hours to diagnose the engine. That meant I had to hang around, so I decided to stop by a nearby diner for lunch. The food was decent, but I kept replaying last night's events in my mind. The footsteps, the doorknob turning, the open door. It wasn't my imagination. I heard it clearly, and I saw that faint light in the gap. The mechanic eventually called me and said the problem was more serious than he thought. He needed more time to find parts. He told me it might stretch into the next day. I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. I would need another night at the inn. I considered finding a motel somewhere else, but everything else was too far away, and I didn't want to risk driving my car for more than I had to. I drove back to the inn around late afternoon, hoping the second night would pass quickly. I parked my car and got out. I noticed how quiet it was outside. There were trees in the distance and an empty field behind the building. I walked around to stretch my legs. As I came back toward my room, I glanced up at the small window. My heart skipped a beat. I saw someone standing there. It was a silhouette, just a dark shape. I couldn't see details, but it looked like a person facing me. My body tensed. I dropped my keys. When I picked them up and looked again, the figure was gone. I sprinted inside, took the hallway to my room, and unlocked the door. No one was there. The bed was undisturbed, the desk was the same, and the window was closed. My bag sat where I left it. I felt a tingling sensation in my neck. My stomach felt knotted. I scanned every corner. I opened the closet. Empty. I checked under the bed. Just dust. I felt ridiculous, but I knew what I saw. Someone was at the window. I closed the door behind me and locked it from the inside. I went to talk to the owner again. He was reading in a worn-out armchair by the lobby. I told him I saw someone in my window. He looked puzzled. He said there were no other guests, and he had been in the kitchen for the past hour. His tone was calm, but he seemed uncomfortable. I wondered if he knew something he didn't want to share. I didn't press him. I felt tired and on edge. I asked if I could have an extra lamp or something for my room. He nodded and gave me a small table lamp from a storage closet. Back in my room, I set up the extra lamp near the dresser. I thought it might help me feel less jumpy if the space was brighter. Then I tried to distract myself by organizing some work files on my laptop. I went over documents for the meeting I was supposed to have. I was annoyed about the delay, but I couldn't focus for long. My mind kept drifting to the events of the previous night. When it got dark outside, I felt my pulse quicken. I kept the main light on and the lamp lit, but the corners still looked gloomy. I decided to take a hot shower in the shared bathroom. The water pressure was weak, but at least the water was warm. I stood there for a while, letting the steam fill the small room. I tried to push out the uneasy thoughts. Afterward, I dried off, got dressed, and went back to my room. The hallway was quiet. I felt relieved, but also tense, like I was waiting for something to happen. I sat on the bed, rummaging through my phone, checking messages and reading the news. Nothing interesting. Time felt like it was crawling. Around 11 p.m., I started to feel sleepy. I considered leaving the lights on all night, but the glare was too bright and I figured it would keep me awake anyway. I turned off the overhead light but kept the small lamp on. I stretched out on the bed on top of the covers. Every small noise made me twitch. The wind against the window, the creak of the walls. My own breathing sounded too loud. Hours passed. I looked at my phone again around 2 a.m. I could feel my eyelids getting heavy. I started to doze off and then I heard it. The footsteps in the hallway. They were the same heavy steps, moving from one end to the other. My heart thudded. I felt my mouth go dry. I sat up, swinging my legs off the bed. I stared at the door, waiting to see if it would happen again. The steps approached, paused, then retreated. I stood, tiptoed to the door, and pressed my ear against it. My heart was pounding in my ears. The hallway was quiet for a few seconds. Then the footsteps started again, right outside. The doorknob jiggled softly, once. I heard a faint click. I felt a surge of adrenaline. My scalp tingled. I turned the lock on my side, but the door still rattled as if someone tried to open it. Then everything went still. I backed away from the door, gripping my phone. My hands were shaking. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my jacket and slowly opened the door, ready to confront whoever was out there. The hallway lights were dim. I saw nothing. All the doors were closed and the corridor was empty. There was no sound, no movement. The place felt dead still. I walked down the hallway, checking each corner. I peeked into the lobby. The lights were off and there was no sign of the owner. The entire building was silent. I returned to my room, locked the door, and sat on the bed, breathing hard. My stomach was in knots. I was sweating. I couldn't think straight. I didn't know what else to do, so I stayed there fully clothed with the lamp on. For the rest of the night, I didn't hear any more footsteps. My eyes kept drifting to the window, expecting to see a shape there again. I felt like someone was just outside my door, waiting. I stared at the clock on my phone, watching the minutes tick by. I felt exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. Every small sound made me jump. When the first rays of light started to show through the window, I breathed a little easier. I could hear birds outside, which somehow made things feel normal again. I packed my bag in a hurry and walked to the lobby. I found the owner carrying a carton of eggs from the kitchen. He gave me a nod, but I didn't bother with breakfast. I just thanked him for the room and told him I had to go check on my car. He smiled politely, but he must have seen how anxious I was. I didn't mention the footsteps or the figure in the window this time. It didn't matter. I just wanted to leave. I put my things in the car and drove off, hoping the mechanic had good news. My head felt heavy and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone in the back seat. I was sure there was something else in that inn with me, but I couldn't explain it. I never did figure out who or what walked those halls at 3 a.m, and I never found out who stood at my window. I only know I stayed awake the rest of that second night, heart pounding, convinced I wasn't alone. I still remember the day I first saw the place. It felt huge, and I was proud of myself for finally getting a spacious townhouse. The previous owner walked me around, pointed out the living room, kitchen, bedrooms, and everything else. But there was one locked room upstairs. He didn't bother explaining much. He just said, "That's off limits. I'm not giving you permission to do anything with it." I didn't press him. I was too excited about moving in to care about a single locked room. But it stuck in my mind. It was like a small puzzle that I wasn't allowed to solve. I'm not a superstitious guy. I don't go looking for secrets. Still, I couldn't ignore the idea that there was a space in my new home that I couldn't access. On my first night after moving in, I was busy settling boxes in the hallway. I passed by that door several times. It was locked with a simple keyhole. Through the gap at the bottom, I could see a bit of darkness. Nothing special. But my curiosity was growing. I knelt down, put my eye to the keyhole, and tried to see inside. I didn't see much. I could make out the shape of a covered bed, maybe some furniture draped with cloth. My phone flashlight couldn't reach anything from there. The door was solid. I felt a little silly peering into a room like that, so I stood up and told myself I'd leave it alone. The owner had said not to touch it, and I had no intention of risking my lease. During the first couple of weeks, I mostly forgot about the room. I had boxes to unpack, shelves to assemble, and a bunch of errands to run. Work was hectic, and I spent more time outside than inside. When I was home, I was either sleeping or organizing. At night, I'd occasionally pass by that locked door on my way to the bathroom, but it seemed normal. No noises, no weird sensations, just a locked door. Then around the end of the second week, I was in bed one evening, scrolling through my phone before sleep, and I heard what sounded like a soft rattle. It was faint. I wasn't even sure I heard it at first, so I paused and listened. It was coming from the hallway. It was the doorknob on that locked room. My heart sped up a bit. I thought maybe there was a draft or something pushing it, but there wasn't any window open in that hallway. The rest of the townhouse was silent. I walked over, put my ear to the door, and waited. No sound, no movement. I shrugged it off. I figured maybe the house was settling, or the latch was loose. I went back to bed. A few nights later, I heard it again. This time, it was a more distinct rattling noise, as if someone was trying to turn the knob from inside. My hand went cold. My forehead started sweating a bit. I switched on the hallway light and stared at the door. The rattling stopped immediately. I walked closer and jiggled the knob myself. Still locked. I leaned in. Nothing. For a minute, I considered calling the owner to ask about it, but it was late, and I felt stupid. I went back to my bedroom, closed the door, and tried to sleep, but it took me a while to calm down. On a Sunday afternoon, things got more intense. I was in the living room, relaxing on the couch. I had the TV on low volume. It was bright outside, a calm day. Then out of nowhere, I heard a sound from upstairs. It wasn't just a knob rattling this time. It sounded like something heavy scraping against the floor. Long drags across the wood. I froze. My first thought was that someone had broken into the house, but I had locked the front door and all the windows. I muted the TV and listened carefully. The noise continued for several seconds. Slow, deliberate dragging. My chest tightened. I was scared. I admit it. I'm not used to strange noises in my home, especially not from a locked room. I picked up a small crowbar I keep under the couch. My hands were trembling. I moved slowly up the stairs, staying close to the wall. My breathing was shaky, and my heart pounded in my ears. When I reached the hallway, everything went quiet again. I stood there for a moment, thinking maybe I should call the cops. But the door still looked the same, locked tight. No signs of forced entry. No footprints on the floor, no marks around the doorknob. I placed my ear against the wood. It was so quiet that I could hear my own pulse in my head. Then I heard one faint step inside. A single creak. I jumped back, feeling a hot rush of adrenaline. The hairs on my arms stood up. I gripped the crowbar, but I didn't dare try to break down the door. Something in me said that would be a bad idea. I backed away and went back down. I sat on the couch, heart racing, but I didn't hear anything else that day. Still, I stayed alert, glancing at the stairs every few minutes. I couldn't focus on anything else. My stomach was churning. It felt like I was waiting for something else to happen. But the afternoon and evening passed with no more noises. When I tried to sleep that night, I lay awake for hours, listening to every tiny creak or pop in the house, convinced something might move again behind that door. Over the next few days, my tension stayed high. I was jumpy. Every time I walked upstairs, I expected to hear a shuffle or a thump. Sometimes I'd stand in front of the locked room just staring at it. I'd think about all sorts of explanations. Maybe the owner was storing some old machinery, or maybe there was an animal trapped inside. But I kept coming back to the same memory. I looked through that keyhole before. There was a bed and some furniture under sheets, but it didn't look like there was anything that would start moving on its own. I finally snapped one evening when I heard my name. I was almost asleep. My bedroom door was slightly open, and the hallway light was off. I heard it so clearly. Eric. A whisper, coming from the direction of the locked room. I sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I didn't get up right away. I just aimed the light toward my bedroom door and waited. I stayed like that for a long time, not breathing too loudly, hoping I wouldn't hear it again. But I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I forced myself to close the door and lock it. I slept with the phone in my hand. My neck was stiff the next morning from how tense I'd been all night. At that point, I decided I wasn't going to live in fear of a locked room. I remembered I had a universal key set in a tool bag I keep in the garage. It's not some fancy set, but it's come in handy before for opening old locks. The next day I grabbed the kit, went upstairs and stared at the doorknob. My stomach twisted. My palms were sweaty. I kept telling myself I'd do it quickly. I placed the tools in the keyhole, took a deep breath. It felt like I was doing something forbidden, but I couldn't go on without answers. It took me a few tries to get the lock to click. When it finally turned, I felt a jolt of anticipation. I gripped the knob and slowly pushed the door open. The hinges creaked. The room was dim because the shutters were closed. I switched on the overhead light, which worked. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It hit me like stepping into a walk-in freezer. My skin broke out in goosebumps. My breath came out in short bursts. The bed was covered by a dusty sheet. There was a nightstand, a dresser, and a chair, all draped in old fabric. The floor was wooden, with a bit of a musty smell. The air felt heavy, like it hadn't moved in years. I walked in carefully, stepping around random boxes. I saw a lamp on the nightstand. I reached out and touched the bedpost. It was ice cold. My fingertips stung. I couldn't figure out why it was so cold in there. It was summer, and the rest of the house was warm. I checked the windows. They were closed and locked from the inside. I ran my hand over one of the sheets covering the furniture. It was damp, or maybe just cold with condensation. Either way, it left a weird feeling on my skin. Then the nausea hit me. My stomach churned, and I felt like I was going to vomit. My head got light. My vision blurred for a second. I had to brace myself against the dresser. My breath came in gasps. I don't usually get nauseous, so it was alarming. I felt a sudden wave of panic, and I turned around and headed for the door. I stumbled back into the hallway and slammed the door shut behind me, leaving it unlocked. I knelt on the floor, breathing hard, trying not to throw up. My shirt was damp with sweat. After a minute or so, I felt a bit better, but my heart was still racing. I locked the door again from the outside, as if that would stop anything that might be in there. I went downstairs and tried to calm down. My head was pounding. I drank some water and sat at the kitchen table. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I couldn't believe how cold it was in that room. And that smell and the damp fabric. None of it made sense. The rest of the house was at a normal temperature. The sun was shining outside, but upstairs it felt like a refrigerator. I realized I hadn't seen any vents or anything that could explain it. I glanced at the time. It was mid-afternoon, but I felt exhausted like I'd run a marathon in my head. Since then, I can't walk through the hallway without my nerves going off. I keep looking at that door, remembering what I felt in there. It's hard to describe the dread. It's not just fear. It's more like my body reacting to something it can't process. My shoulders tense up, my eyes get watery, and my skin feels clammy every time I'm near that locked room. Sometimes when I'm in the bathroom with the door open, I think I hear a faint scratch or shuffle from inside that forbidden space. My name, too, whispered at random moments. Late at night when I'm half asleep, I catch myself focusing on every sound, wondering if I'll hear it again. I haven't told the owner. He warned me not to mess with it, and I'm pretty sure I violated the agreement by picking that lock. But I can't see myself sleeping peacefully without knowing what's going on in there. I've double-checked online if there could be some sort of air leak causing temperature drops, or if maybe there's an old pipe that's rattling. But none of that explains the footsteps or the sound of something heavy dragging. And nothing explains my name being spoken. Now, every night, I debate whether to open that door again. Maybe I should set up a camera or a recording device inside to see what's happening. But I'm afraid of what I might find. I don't want to walk into that icy air again, feeling nauseous and on the verge of panic. The memory of that cold is still fresh in my mind. And there's this sense that if I go in there again, something worse might happen. I still live here. I haven't broken my lease, and I haven't packed up. Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's because everything else about the place is great. I love the big kitchen and the high ceilings. I like my bedroom, which has a nice balcony view, but that one room is always in the back of my head. Sometimes I think about hiring someone else to check it out, but I can't imagine explaining the situation to a contractor or a handyman. Hey, I've got this locked room that feels like a freezer, and sometimes I hear weird noises inside, including my name whispered. Mind taking a look? They'd either think I'm crazy or charge me a fortune. I tried ignoring it, I really did. For a few days I kept the hallway light on at night, just so I wouldn't feel so spooked passing by. But the idea that there might be something inside moving around wouldn't go away. My sleep has gotten worse. I wake up tired and I'm more irritable. I'm jumpy at work. I come home expecting to find the door wide open or something. But it's always closed, locked just how I left it. Occasionally I still hear the handle rattle. I'll be in the kitchen washing dishes, and I'll hear a faint metallic vibration. I'll turn off the faucet, hold my breath, and listen. It always stops when I move. I've put my ear to the door again on a few occasions, and I swear I hear breathing or some kind of faint movement inside. It sends chills down my spine. My scalp prickles. My heart starts beating like crazy. I've also started getting headaches. They come on when I'm near the door. I've noticed a pattern. The closer I get, the more pressure I feel in my temples. Once I go back downstairs, it fades. I've tried opening a window in the hallway to let fresh air in. No change. That room stays cold and sealed, and I stay anxious. I'm at a point where I'm not sure what to do next. I can't go on living like this forever, but I'm not ready to give up the house. It's a good place except for that damn room. Sometimes I think about just opening it again in the middle of the day, turning on all the lights, and ripping those sheets off the furniture to see what's underneath. Maybe I'd find something ordinary, a broken bed frame or a few old trunks. But I can't get rid of the fear that there's something else going on, something that doesn't make sense in a normal way. I keep the door locked now, and I keep the key hidden in a drawer in my bedroom. I stare at it sometimes, wondering if I should destroy it or give it back to the owner. But I can't bring myself to do either. So I'm stuck in this strange limbo, living in a house with a room that feels alive in a bad way. My name, the dragging sounds, the rattling doorknob, the freezing air, the nausea, they've all become a part of my daily life. That's where I'm at. I'm just trying to cope. I'm thinking about installing a new lock on that door. Maybe something stronger, but then again, the sound could still happen. There's no guarantee it'll stop anything. I don't know what's inside that room or why it feels so wrong, but I know I don't like it. And every time I walk by, my stomach tightens and I hurry past. The tension is constant, and I've never felt anything like it before. I wonder if I'll ever get used to it. I wonder if it'll just keep getting worse. Right now, all I can do is wait and see, and every night I brace myself for that whisper. Eric. I felt my heart pounding the second I stepped into the clinic that Saturday evening. It was around 5 in the afternoon and the sun was already going down. I could tell right away something felt off. The clinic was always quiet on weekends, but that day, the silence felt heavier than usual. The hallway lights were on at half power and everything seemed too still. My name's Daniel, and I work as an administrative assistant at a medical clinic. We close every weekend, but I had a ton of paperwork to organize before Monday. Our management software had messed up some patient records, and I needed to find physical copies to verify everything. My boss told me I could stay late during the week, but I figured it'd be easier to come in on Saturday when no one else was around. I thought I'd get through the stack of papers faster if I could focus without interruptions. The day started off normally. I used my key to get in, turned on the necessary lights, and headed to my small office near the reception desk. The clinic has one main corridor lined with 3 exam rooms, a small lab area, a storage room, and an office for the doctors. The reception desk sits at the entrance right behind a glass window with a sliding partition. My little office is off to the side near the manager's office. It's a modest space with a computer, a filing cabinet, and a desk that barely fits my chair and a small shelf. I began by pulling out the patient files I needed to match with the digital records. There were maybe 50 or 60 folders, each stuffed with forms and test results. I spent a few hours cross-referencing the documents, making sure the addresses, phone numbers, and medical notes matched what we had on the computer system. It was mind-numbing work, but I'd done it hundreds of times before. Everything was calm. I didn't hear much beyond the hum of the fluorescent lights and the rustle of paper. Around 7, I decided to take a break. I had brought a sandwich in a small cooler, so I walked to the break room behind the reception area. That's when I noticed how quiet the clinic felt. There's usually some background sound like the ventilation system or the little fridge in the break room, but that day, it felt like everything was muffled. I figured it was just me being jumpy, because I'm not used to being there alone on a Saturday. I shrugged it off, microwaved my sandwich for a few seconds, and sat at one of the small tables. The break room light flickered once, but I saw that happen before. It's just an old bulb, so I ignored it. I finished my sandwich in about 5 minutes, washed my hands at the small sink, and went back to work. I settled at my desk and kept going through the folders. I tried to be systematic, check name, check date of birth, check notes, confirm all matched, move on. I got into a good rhythm and lost track of time. At some point I noticed it was almost 8:30, so I got up to stretch my legs. I walked into the hallway and turned on more lights so I wouldn't have to move around in the dim setting. That's when the first weird thing happened. The lights in the main corridor flickered, not just once, but in a sequence like a quick blink, then a pause, then another blink. It reminded me of a power surge. It only lasted a second or two. I frowned, looked at the switches, and wondered if there was an electrical issue in the building. But right then, I heard a scraping noise like a chair being dragged across the floor. It came from the exam room at the far end of the corridor. The sound made my skin crawl because it was so distinct. I'd moved tables around in those rooms before, and it always made that rubbery squeak on the tile floor. I walked toward the exam room, my heart thumping. I tried to breathe normally, but my chest felt tight. The door was closed. I remembered locking it earlier in the afternoon because I had this habit of locking the exam rooms when no doctors are in. But now the door was open a few inches. It wasn't wide open, but it definitely wasn't locked or even shut. I nudged it with my foot, expecting to see something out of place. Maybe a rolling stool was misplaced, or maybe a table had been moved, but the room looked normal. The exam table was in its usual spot. The chairs were lined up against the wall, the overhead light was off, and the counters were empty except for a blood pressure cuff and some gloves. It smelled like disinfectant, the same as always. I stepped in, turned on the light, and scanned the room. Nothing seemed to have been moved. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone else around. I tried to convince myself I had just forgotten to lock the door. Maybe I got distracted. But I was pretty sure I'd locked all the exam rooms earlier that day. I did a quick check, flipping the latch back and forth. It seemed fine. I flicked off the light and closed the door again, making sure it clicked. I went back to my desk, but I felt uneasy. I tried to keep working, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the noise I heard. It wasn't my imagination. I knew the sound of something heavy sliding across the floor. It was too clear to ignore. I shook my head and forced myself to keep checking files. I looked at the time, almost 9. I had another hour or so before I planned to leave, so I needed to stay focused. Then, maybe 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps in the reception area. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the sound was distinct. Slow steps on the tile floor, like someone walking carefully. I froze in my chair, holding my breath. The footsteps sounded like they were moving toward my office door. I watched the door handle, waiting for it to turn, but nothing happened. The steps stopped. I stood up, slid my chair back, and opened the door a crack. No one was there. The corridor was empty, the reception desk looked untouched, and the lights were on. I stepped out, trying to stay calm. My throat felt dry, and I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I glanced around. Everything looked the same, except I noticed the main entrance door was still locked from the inside, just like I left it. I couldn't see any reason for those footsteps. I started to wonder if maybe someone had slipped in while I was in the back. But how? The door needs a key, and we have security cameras in the hallway, though they're mostly for show. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe my own steps were echoing, or maybe the building was creaking. I tried to get back to my paperwork. I told myself I'd be out of there soon, and I really wanted to finish the job. But my nerves were on edge. Every little sound made me jump. The hum of the vents, the click of the clock on the wall, the slight buzz of my computer monitor. I felt sweat on my forehead and my hands were clammy. About 15 minutes later, the lights flickered again. This time, there was a brief surge, followed by a pop. One of the corridor lights went out completely, leaving a shadowy patch near the entrance. The rest stayed on, but they seemed dimmer. I tried to keep my cool and got up to check the breaker panel in the storage room. Everything looked normal. None of the switches were tripped. I tapped a few just to be sure. No change. The one corridor light remained off. While I stood there in the storage room, I heard something in the reception area again. It was a soft scuffling sound, like someone shifting their weight on the floor. I took a step out of the storage room and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice echoed in the hallway. No response. I walked slowly to the reception desk. The only movement I saw was the shadow cast by the half-functional lights. I looked over the counter. Nothing. The computer screen at reception was off, and the drawers were all closed. The waiting area chairs were lined up as usual, and the front door was locked. I remember feeling shaky at that point. My stomach was tight, and I had a growing sense of dread. I told myself I should just leave, but then I glanced at the box of files on my desk. I really wanted to finish. It was half pride and half stupidity. I decided to give it one more try. Maybe I was on edge because it was late, and I was alone in a place that's usually bustling with people. I walked back to my office, sat down, and grabbed the top folder. My leg was bouncing under the desk. I stared at the records, but my focus was gone. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving outside my door, passing from left to right, faint against the glass. It was a brief shape, like a person walking by. My heart jumped. I tossed the folder onto the desk and rushed to the door, yanking it open. The corridor was empty again, but I noticed something new this time. The exam room door down the hall, the same one I'd locked earlier, was slightly ajar again. My pulse pounded in my temples. I didn't want to go check, but I couldn't ignore it. I walked toward it, my sneakers squeaking on the tile. The hallway felt colder than before. When I reached the door, I found it open about an inch. I pushed it slowly and hit the light switch. The the room looked exactly the same as before. The chairs were still lined up, the exam table was clean, and nothing was out of place. I checked the window. It was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. I turned off the light and stepped back, pulling the door shut again. This time, I tested the handle several times, pushing the door to make sure the latch caught. It closed with a click, and I tried to pull it open without turning the handle. It stayed locked. I stood there for a moment, listening to my own breathing. I noticed a slight tremor in my hands. Suddenly, I heard a loud thump from the main corridor. It sounded like something heavy dropping onto the floor. I rushed out to look, but everything was in place. The waiting area chairs, the reception counter, the trash bin, all normal. I was done. My nerves were shot. I decided I wasn't going to stick around any longer. That final noise convinced me. I went back to my office, shut down the computer, and stacked the folders away without much order. I wanted to get out. My heart was racing, and I felt a chill in my arms. I could barely think straight, but I managed to lock my desk drawers and grab my jacket. I walked to the front door, checking over my shoulder every few steps. I didn't see anything or anyone, but I felt eyes on me. I undid the lock on the front door and stepped out into the chilly night air. The sky was completely dark by then, and the parking lot was empty except for my car. I shut the door behind me, locked it, and practically ran to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my keys. After I got inside, I locked the doors immediately and started the engine. As I drove away, I noticed the clinic windows. All the lights were still on except for that one busted corridor light. I stared at the building for a moment. My breath was uneven and I felt sweat under my shirt. I didn't see any movement inside, but I didn't want to stay long enough to find out if anything else would happen. I got home and tried to calm down, but my mind kept replaying those noises in the shadow. I kept thinking about how the door was open again, even though I was so sure I locked it. The next Monday, I showed up for work like usual. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I was afraid they'd think I was making it up, or that I'd just panicked over a flickering light. But part of me is still convinced something else was there that night. I haven't gone back to the clinic alone on a weekend since then. If I have extra work, I do it during the week, or I bring it home. I always feel a little rush of tension when I pass that exam room now. Sometimes I notice the door is open when it should be shut, or I hear a small creak when I'm by myself late in the day. I force myself to ignore it, but I still get a knot in my stomach every time. That night, I never saw anyone face to face. But I know I heard footsteps, I know I saw that shadow, and I know the door didn't stay locked like it should have. The memory of those flickering lights and the scraping noise still makes the hair on my arms stand up. Even now, if someone asks me to stay late at the clinic alone, I find some excuse. I can't shake that feeling that I wasn't alone in there, even though I never saw a single living soul. I walked into the library basement that night with a stiff feeling in my shoulders and a slight tremor in my hands. I didn't believe in hidden voices or strange movements before I started working here. I liked books. I liked the smell of them and the sense of calm they brought me. But I had never heard whispers in empty aisles until I took this job. Now, I can't get those sounds out of my head. I work in an old university library. It has classic wooden shelves, heavy tables, and thick carpets on most floors. The building feels formal in the daytime. Students come in, study for hours, and leave. Professors wander around, check references, and talk in quiet tones. Staff members have their routines, returning books, organizing carts, fixing old volumes, and answering questions at the front desk. During regular hours, everything seems normal. Things change at night, especially in the basement. It's cold down there. The air smells stale, like dust and mildew. The lighting is weak. Most bulbs are old, so they flicker sometimes, and it makes the shadows shift on the walls. Nobody hangs around the basement unless they have to, because the place is mostly used for archived research books. Students rarely venture into that section. They prefer modern references upstairs, so it's usually just me organizing shelves, logging inventory, and pulling old books for small repairs. I remember the first time I noticed anything odd. I was shelving a few old journals in the far corner of the basement. The corridor there is cramped, and the shelves are tall. I was stacking volumes in alphabetical order. I heard a quiet sound, almost like two people whispering. It wasn't a normal hum from the vents or a squeak from the old pipes. It sounded like words. I couldn't pick out what they were saying, but I could swear I heard syllables. I stopped moving books, held my breath, and tried to listen. I heard soft hissing and small pauses, the way conversations break every few words. My arms tensed up. I turned around, looked across the row of shelves, and saw nothing. I thought maybe a colleague was talking on the other side. I walked around the corner, but it was empty. I decided I might have imagined it. I had a long shift, and my mind sometimes plays tricks on me when I'm tired. I went back to the cart and continued shelving. That whispering continued on random nights. It would appear for a moment, then vanish. I started checking more carefully whenever I heard it. I would turn corners quickly, shine my small flashlight under the shelves, or call out to see if someone was there. Each time the sound stopped. Each time I found no one. I even asked a coworker if the basement had any weird acoustics, like maybe I was hearing a conversation from upstairs echoing through the vents. He shrugged and said he had never heard anything. He seemed genuine. That left me with no explanation. One evening, I stayed past my usual time. The library was nearly empty. It was close to midnight. I had a small list of tasks to complete: finalize an inventory of old reference books, check some spines for damage, and lock up a storage room in the back. I liked working alone sometimes because it was peaceful. I could concentrate on each book, note its condition, and move on. But that night I felt nervous for no clear reason. The silence made my skin crawl. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard a dull thud from a nearby aisle. I thought maybe a book fell off a cart. I set down my clipboard and walked over to see if something slipped. When I got closer, I saw a heavy black book lying on the floor near the bottom of a tall shelf. Nothing else seemed out of place. I picked it up and felt how cold the leather cover was. My pulse sped up. The overhead light above that shelf flickered a few times. I glanced upward, wondering if maybe the bulb was dying. Then I noticed the gap where the book must have come from. It sat about 3 rows up. There was no cart, and I hadn't placed anything there that night. I looked around to see if anyone was nearby. Nobody was there. I felt my heart pounding in my ears. I wondered if the shelf was angled, but it seemed stable. I thought about old wood or a tilted board, but I didn't see any tilt. I flipped open the cover. There was a library stamp from decades ago. The pages smelled musty. I saw some writing that looked like old notes. None of it made sense to me. It was cramped handwriting in the margins, symbols and short words that didn't form sentences. I tried to read the scrawls, but I gave up after a few seconds. Then, right behind me, I felt a slight draft. It moved across my neck, and I felt the hairs on my arms lift. I turned around fast, expecting to see someone leaning over my shoulder. I was alone. My throat felt tight. I closed the book and tried to stay calm. I put it back on the shelf, but I kept thinking about how I heard that noise and saw that book on the ground. I couldn't find a logical reason for it. I went back to my desk in the corner of the basement and tried to finish my inventory. My mind wouldn't focus. I kept glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I felt like someone was watching me, the same sense you get when a person stands behind you in a line. My heart kept pounding, and I kept rubbing the back of my neck to see if there was a cold spot or some strange change in temperature. The overhead lights flickered again. They settled after a few moments, but I was uneasy. About half an hour later, I heard that whispering again. It was much clearer this time. 2 distinct voices whispering at once. They sounded close, maybe 2 or 3 rows away. I stood up slowly, trying not to make noise. I wanted to surprise whoever was there. I walked toward the sound. My footsteps were soft on the concrete floor. The whispering continued. It didn't sound excited or angry. It just sounded like two people carrying on a conversation in low voices. Then I got to the end of the row, turned, and saw nothing. The whispers stopped. My chest felt tight. I grabbed a small flashlight from my belt and looked down the aisle. I saw only shelves, books, and some loose papers on one of the carts. No one was there. My breath was shaky. My right hand started to tremble, and I realized I was gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles were white. I needed a break. I left the basement for a few minutes. I walked up to the main floor and looked around for another staff member. Nobody was at the front desk. I remembered that the main desk closes earlier on certain nights, so I walked to a side corridor where the staff break room is located. I found a colleague there sipping coffee from a paper cup. He was reading something on his phone. I asked him if he had been in the basement recently. He shook his head. I asked if he heard anything unusual. He said no. I felt silly pressing the issue, so I dropped it. I just told him I was finishing my shift soon. He nodded and wished me a quiet night. I returned to the basement. I sat at my small metal desk and forced myself to resume my work. I didn't want to get stuck there all night. I had about 10 more books to log in the inventory. I tried not to think about the whispers. I tried to focus on the shape of the books, the condition of the spines, and the call numbers on the covers. When I was done, I stacked the last few volumes on a return cart and stood up. I felt that presence behind me again, like someone leaning in. My body reacted before I could think. I spun around, flashlight raised. The light swept over old shelves and dusty floors. I didn't see a single figure. My throat felt dry. I had a taste of adrenaline in my mouth. I told myself to calm down. I knew if I lost my composure, I'd end up running out of there. I just wanted to lock the place up and leave. I decided to walk through the aisles one last time to make sure everything was in order. I carried my flashlight and stepped carefully, scanning each row. The shelves seemed normal. No books were out of place. The floor was clear. I turned off a few desk lamps and closed the storage room in the back. I was about to climb the stairs when I heard a dull creak. I froze, thinking it was a door. I turned the flashlight toward the noise. It came from a shelf near the far wall. I stood still for a moment, waiting. The shelf looked sturdy. It didn't move. I waited for another sound, but it never came. After a few seconds, I forced myself to keep going. At the top of the stairs, I turned off the basement lights with the switch on the wall. It felt like a relief to be out of that cold space. I locked the basement door and left for the night. I couldn't sleep well. I kept thinking I heard footsteps in my apartment. Every creak of the floor made me sit up in bed. I felt jumpy and tired. The next day at work, I stuck to the main floor as much as possible. I had some duties upstairs, like helping with a new shipment of textbooks. I avoided going down to the basement until late afternoon. Eventually, though, I had to bring down some volumes that belonged in the old archive. My stomach felt tight the entire time. When I stepped off the elevator in the basement, I noticed the lights were still flickering a bit. I heard the hum of the ventilation system. There was no one else around. I took the books over to the shelf where they belonged. I kept checking behind me, worried I might hear those whispers again. Everything stayed quiet. I shelved the books quickly and tried to leave. On my way out, I saw that black book again. It was in the same spot on the shelf, about 3 rows up. I felt a sudden chill. I leaned in to check it, half expecting it to move or slip off. It stayed in place. I touched its spine. The leather felt cool. I pulled it down again and opened it to the page with the strange notes. My eyes scanned the scribbles. It looked like someone wrote random characters in pencil. I saw a few crossed out lines. I didn't see a pattern. It made no sense to me. I closed the book, placed it back, and left. I told myself not to dwell on it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, the whispers continued. They never lasted long enough for me to figure out what they said. Sometimes it sounded like they were right behind me. Other times, it was faint, as if coming from the far end of the room. I started dreading my shifts. I took every chance I could to work upstairs. I did my best to stay out of the basement whenever possible. One night, though, I had no choice. A professor requested a rare journal from the archives. I had to go down and find it before morning. The basement was empty again. I searched the shelves for the journal. My hand shook a little as I flipped through the older volumes. The pages felt brittle under my fingertips. My flashlight's beam illuminated dust motes floating in the air. The overhead light seemed dimmer than usual. I caught that soft whispering out of the corner of my hearing. It was distant at first, but it moved closer. I swallowed hard and called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed. The whispering paused, then resumed. It made my heart pound. I followed the sound, shining my flashlight in front of me. The corridor ended at a row of locked cabinets. There was nothing there. The sound stopped again. A book dropped to the floor behind me. I jumped so hard I almost dropped the flashlight. I turned around and saw another volume lying face down on the ground. It wasn't the black book this time. It was a brown hardcover with gold lettering on the spine. The lights flickered again, and I felt my throat tighten. I picked up the book, placed it back on the shelf, and backed away. I couldn't see how it fell. The shelf wasn't full. There was space between books. Nothing was pressing against it. My chest felt heavy and my forehead started to sweat. I decided I couldn't handle another minute down there. I didn't care if I found that professor's journal. I walked toward the stairs, holding my flashlight in a shaking hand. When I reached the bottom step, I heard a single word behind me. It was in a soft voice, but I couldn't make it out. It sounded like a low whisper, just one syllable. I didn't wait to see what it was. I took the stairs 2 at a time and left the basement. Now I still work in the library. I still have to go to the basement sometimes. I do what I have to do, but I don't linger. I keep my tasks short. I don't investigate strange sounds anymore. When I hear whispers, I focus on finishing my job. My heart still races every time the lights flicker. If a book falls off a shelf, I pick it up and put it back without looking at the pages. I don't read the scribbles. I don't listen to the voices. I just want to get out of there. I don't know what causes these things. I don't talk about it with my coworkers much. I don't bring friends here to see. It's not something I can explain or prove. I only know what I've seen and heard. The night I felt that presence behind me, the whispers in the aisles and the books falling without reason all happened. If you ever find yourself alone in the basement of an old university library, pay attention. You might hear something you can't explain. And if you do, my only advice is don't stay too long. I moved into this house about a year ago. It's nothing fancy, just a single-story place with a wooden floor and a small basement. Right from the start, I noticed small creaks whenever the temperature changed. I figured that was normal. Wood shifts, houses settle. I didn't think much of it, but then the sounds got louder at night. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I wanted to ignore it, but I couldn't. It felt like something under the floor was pushing up against the boards. I began to lose sleep, and I decided I had to figure out what was going on. I remember the first time the noises really made me worry. It was around midnight on a Tuesday. I was in the living room, standing by the couch, when I heard a sudden crack from the floor. It wasn't the usual small creak. This was a sharp sound like a board snapping. My heart started beating fast. I stood there, waiting for another noise, but everything was quiet. I tapped my foot lightly on the spot, trying to see if the board felt loose. It seemed normal. I told myself it was just an old house making old house sounds. A few days later, I heard something different. It sounded like a dull thud from beneath the floor. At first, I thought maybe a tool fell over in the basement, so I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb that I turned on with a pull chain. I checked around and saw nothing out of place. There were a few boxes with old clothes, some broken furniture, and a small rack with tools I rarely used. Everything looked fine. The floor above me looked solid. I didn't see any cracks or holes. I felt a bit silly, so I went back upstairs, but the noises kept happening. A week later, they got more frequent. Every night, around 11 or so, I'd hear a new set of knocks or creaks. Sometimes they were soft and spaced out. Other times they were sharper, almost rhythmic, like something under there was testing the boards. I kept trying to ignore it, but it was impossible to relax. My living room was small, and the hardwood floor felt like it was always shifting under my feet. I started noticing that if I walked into one corner of the room, the noise would stop for a few seconds, as if something sensed my presence. I'd move back, and then the noise would start again. I started worrying about structural problems. I'm not an expert, but I know that if the foundation shifts, you can get weird creaking sounds. So I called a friend who's good with home repairs. He came by on a Saturday afternoon. We walked through the place together. He tapped on the walls. He measured some stuff in the basement. He said everything looked fine, structurally. He told me old houses just do that sometimes. Then he left, and I was alone again. That night, I sat on my couch watching TV with the volume low. I dozed off. I woke up around 2 in the morning and realized the TV was still on. I heard a soft knock under my feet. It sounded like someone gently tapping on the wood from below. The living room was dark, except for the glow from the TV. I felt my muscles tense up. My stomach felt tight. I leaned forward and put my hand on the floor. I felt a slight vibration, like a faint tremor. My heart began to race. It seemed like something was moving under the house, but the basement was just an empty space with boxes. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and headed downstairs. My footsteps on the wooden steps echoed through the quiet house. The basement was still. The air felt cold and stale. I swept the flashlight beam along the floor joists and walls. There were cobwebs in the corners, a few nails stuck in the wooden beams, and a couple of old storage boxes. Nothing looked disturbed. No animals. No open holes. I stood there for a while, trying to catch any movement or sound. It was silent. When I came back upstairs, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. I couldn't explain it. I just felt uneasy. I locked the basement door and went to my bedroom, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to that tapping sound. Around 4 in the morning, I finally dozed off. Over the next couple of days, I tried to stay busy. I went to work, saw a movie with a friend, and spent less time at home. But every time I returned, I had to walk across that same living room. The floor felt hostile. I started wearing slippers, even though I usually walk around barefoot. I didn't like the feeling of the wood under my feet anymore. It felt like I was stepping on something alive. A few nights later, the noises ramped up. Around midnight, I heard a sharp series of cracks in quick succession. It was almost like someone was slamming a fist against the underside of the boards. I jumped off the couch and stood in the center of the room, not sure what to do. My breathing was shaky, and I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? There was no sign of a break-in, there was no voice or anything like that. It was just these pounding sounds under the floor. I decided to document it. I grabbed my phone and started recording. I walked around the living room with the microphone pointed at the floor. I heard the knocking with my own ears, but when I played the recording back, all I got was a faint static hiss. There was no knocking sound. I tried again in different spots. Same result. I could hear it clearly in real life, but the phone picked up nothing. I felt frustrated and a bit scared. It made me question my own senses, though the sounds were too distinct to be my imagination. I crouched down and put my ear to the floor. I heard a slow, steady noise like breathing. It wasn't my own breath. I held my breath to make sure. There was a soft inhale and exhale coming through the wood. My scalp tingled and I felt a flush of heat spread across my face. My mind went blank. I stayed there for several seconds, listening. Then I heard a low rumble, almost like a growl, and I jerked back. I stood up quickly and walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and tried to calm down. My hand was shaking, so I gripped the edge of the sink to steady myself. I spent the next day at work trying to forget about it. But by the time I got home that evening, I felt dread creeping in. The sun was setting, and I knew I'd have to face the sounds again. Around 9, I heard the first creak. It was the usual sound. Then at 10, a few more knocks. By 11, I was tense and on edge, waiting for something bigger. But nothing happened. I felt a little relieved. I went to bed around midnight, half expecting the pounding to start when I turned off the lights. But it stayed quiet. I thought maybe it was all over. The next night, I was in bed again, reading a book. I heard a sudden series of thuds. It came from directly below my bedroom, which is next to the living room. I froze. My pulse was pounding and my mouth felt dry. I forced myself to go look. I took my phone for light, walked into the living room, and aimed the light at the floor. Nothing seemed out of place, but I felt tiny vibrations under my feet, almost imperceptible. I got on my knees and pressed my ear to the floor again. I heard something scraping. It sounded like fingernails or maybe claws. I don't know. My throat went tight, and I pulled my head away. I thought about calling someone to come over, but it was late. I felt foolish. No one was going to believe me without proof. I decided to do one more check in the basement. This time I took a heavier flashlight and a small crowbar, just in case. The basement light buzzed when I turned it on. The concrete floor felt cold through my socks. I scanned every corner, every box. I tapped the walls. I stared at the space where the floor joists met the beams. I listened for any movement. I stood there, heart racing, waiting for something to happen, but it was dead silent. Finally, I went back upstairs. I couldn't sleep in my bedroom that night. I grabbed some blankets and stayed on the couch in the living room. I wanted to be close to the noise in case it started again. I kept my phone nearby. I tried to stay awake, but I dozed off. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a vibrating sensation. It felt like something was humming under the floor, almost like an engine running in a distant room. I sat up. My muscles were stiff from sleeping on the couch. I pressed my bare foot against the wooden boards. They were shaking slightly, like a low tremor. Then the humming stopped. My ears were ringing. I felt my hair standing on end. For a moment, I just sat there, not sure what to do. My mind was racing with thoughts about what could be causing this. Maybe there was some kind of machine or generator in the neighborhood. Maybe the pipes were acting up. But none of that explained the breathing sounds or the sharp knocks. I wrapped myself in the blanket and stayed still. My heart wouldn't slow down, and my mouth tasted bitter from adrenaline. Eventually, I drifted off again. The next morning, I woke up late, feeling exhausted. My back ached, and my head was pounding. I looked at the floor and didn't feel safe walking on it. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. The house was silent in daylight, like none of it had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong beneath those boards. I tried to think of a logical explanation, but nothing came to mind. Later, I called another friend who used to work in construction. He said he couldn't come out for a while, but he'd take a look eventually. I didn't want to wait, but I had no other options. That night, I decided to try recording the audio again, but this time with an old digital recorder I found in a junk drawer. I tested it by talking into it, and it worked fine. Around 9, the usual creak started. I put the recorder on the floor and waited. I heard faint thuds and cracks, and once again that steady breathing. After a few minutes, I played it back, but I only heard static. It was the same problem I had with my phone. No real evidence. I felt a chill run through my body. It made no sense. I ended up sleeping in my car that night because I didn't want to be inside the house. The idea of those vibrations under my feet made me feel sick. My palms were sweating just thinking about it. I left the porch light on, locked the doors, and reclined the seat. I didn't sleep well at all. Every so often I looked at the dark windows, half expecting to see something staring back at me. I felt lonely and anxious, but I didn't want to call anyone and bother them with this. In the morning, I went back inside. The floor looked the same as ever. I had to get clothes for work, so I walked carefully, stepping lightly, almost holding my breath with each step. The board squeaked a bit under my weight. I didn't feel any vibration. I told myself maybe it was just a weird phenomenon that would pass, but deep down, I knew I needed to deal with it. That's where things stand now. The house is quiet during the day and I can almost pretend nothing's wrong. But each evening the noises come back. Sometimes they're soft, sometimes they're violent. I've felt the floor shake. I've heard what sounds like breathing or scraping from below. I've tried recording it and it never shows up. I've searched the basement and there's nothing there. I can't see anything under the floor. Everything looks normal, yet every night I feel that tension building up. I don't go barefoot anymore. I don't want to feel that sensation of something pushing up from underneath. I keep waiting for the moment when it all stops or when something else happens. My nerves are shot. My appetite is gone. I stare at the floor, half expecting to see a plank lift on its own. I don't know what to do next. I'm thinking of staying in a motel for a while. Maybe if I leave, I'll get some peace. But then I wonder if I'll come back and find something worse. For now, I'm just taking it one night at a time. I lock the basement door. I try to keep busy until I feel tired enough to collapse. When the noises start, I sit there, listening, heart racing, muscles tense. I wait to see if the vibrations will get stronger. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they fade. Then I get up in the morning and pretend life is normal. But it's not. It hasn't been normal for a while, and I have no idea how to fix it. I stood at the top of the basement stairs holding the doorknob and I felt my hand shaking. I didn't want to go back down there, but I knew I had to finish what I started. My camera equipment was all set up. My film was half developed. The chemicals were already mixed. I had spent too much time and too much money to quit. Still, my neck felt stiff and my heart was pounding. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped onto the first creaking step. I'm not a professional photographer. I'm just a guy who likes taking pictures, mostly black and white shots of urban areas, old buildings, and sometimes abandoned places. It seemed like a good idea to set up my own darkroom in the basement to save money and have some control over the developing process. I moved some boxes around, blocked off a small space with plywood, and installed red safety lights and a basic ventilation system. I thought it would be simple. It wasn't. On the first night, I went downstairs to develop a few test shots. Everything felt normal at first. The steps squeaked the same way they always did. The basement smelled a bit damp and musty, which wasn't unusual. But the moment I turned on the red safety light, I got this cold feeling on my skin, like a draft on a winter morning. The air felt dense, and I could hear the humming of the ventilation fan echoing in my ears. I shrugged it off. I told myself it was just nerves because I was new to developing film. After a few days, I started noticing small things. The lamp would flicker for a split second, even though I had replaced the bulb the day before. My tripod, which I usually kept locked in place against a wall, shifted positions by an inch or two. I thought maybe I was the one bumping into it, but I never remembered touching it. When I tried to dismiss it, my gut tightened as if I knew something else was going on, but I didn't want to admit it. One night, I was in the middle of developing a batch of photos from an abandoned train station. The water in the tank was swirling around. I was focused on the timer ticking away. Out of nowhere, I heard a soft click, like metal against metal. I froze. I turned my head and looked at my tripod. It was standing near the corner, but it seemed a little out of line. I stared at it, waiting to see if it would move again. Nothing happened. I felt a pulse in my ears, like I could hear my own heartbeat in my head. I decided to wrap up for the night. The next day, I examined my negatives. In 3 different images, I saw a faint shadow behind me. It was hard to make out, but the shape was always in the same spot, a bit to the left of my shoulder. At first, I thought it was a lighting error. Then I checked everything. The lighting conditions were identical, but the shadow appeared in places where there shouldn't have been any light interference. That was when I started feeling uneasy all the time. Even outside the basement, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there. I forced myself to keep working. I decided to develop some more rolls. I went down again, turned on the red lamp, and began the usual process. Soak the film, agitate the chemicals, check the timer. I was standing over the trays watching the images appear on the paper. My legs felt restless, like I wanted to run. My stomach was tight. Then the safety lamp flickered 3 times in quick succession. The dark shapes in the developing tray blurred for a moment. I felt a chill on the back of my neck. I grabbed my flashlight, switched it on, and scanned the corners of the room. Everything was where I had left it, but I couldn't shake the impression that something was behind me. I ended up dropping a whole sheet of wet photo paper on the floor. I muttered a few curses under my breath and cleaned it up, but the tension remained. I decided to cut that session short. In the following week, I tried to ignore the oddities. I convinced myself that the old wiring in the basement was causing the flickering lights. I told myself the shifting tripod was me being clumsy. I insisted that the shadow on my negatives was a glitch, but each excuse felt weaker than the last. Every time I put my foot on the first step leading downstairs, a burst of anxiety shot through my chest. My palms would sweat, and I'd feel the hair on my arms stand up. I remember one morning, around 10 a.m., I figured maybe going down there during the day would help. Sunlight was pouring into the rest of the house, but the basement was dark as always. I opened the door, flicked on the normal ceiling light, not the red safety lamp, and stared at the small space. The floor looked damp. I heard the low hum of the dehumidifier in the corner. My tripod was set up in the same spot, close to the wall. My solution bottles were lined up on a makeshift table. Everything seemed ordinary. I took a few steps forward. The overhead bulb started flickering. It clicked a couple of times, then settled into a constant dim light. The air felt cool, but not freezing. I could see my breath for a moment, though, which wasn't normal for a basement that's heated like mine. My heartbeat sped up again. I kept telling myself it was just a bad circuit. I didn't see or hear anything else, so I got to work developing more film. As I was rinsing the negatives, I heard that metallic sound again. It was faint, like the leg of the tripod scraping the floor. I turned around fast, shining my small work light at the corners. The tripod looked like it had twisted a bit to one side. I squeezed my flashlight so tightly that my knuckles hurt. I took slow steps toward it. The metal legs were extended. The handle was locked. I pressed on it to see if it was loose. It felt normal. I moved it back an inch or so. Then I went back to my tray. I tried to ignore the pounding in my head. Later that night, I compared the new negatives to the older ones. The same shadow was there right behind me in 2 shots, still faint, still in the same position. My throat felt dry. I rubbed my eyes, hoping I was seeing something else. But it was clear. The shape was there. My stomach churned. I thought about quitting the darkroom idea altogether, but I couldn't let it go. It felt too important. I wanted to figure out the cause. I continued to work in the basement, always on edge. Every time I reached the bottom step, my muscles tensed up. Sometimes I heard small thuds from the far side of the basement behind some old shelves. Other times I thought I felt a breeze on the back of my neck. Once, while I was mixing developer, I heard breathing that wasn't mine. It was slow, shallow, like someone standing a few feet away. I spun around, shining my flashlight. No one was there. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. My chest felt tight, and it took everything not to sprint back upstairs. A few nights ago, something new happened. I was crouched over the developing tank, switching the film reels, when the safety lights flickered. I braced myself for the usual sounds, but instead, the flicker lasted longer. For about 2 seconds, it went almost completely dark. In that moment, I felt a pressure against my back, like a hand pressing gently between my shoulder blades. I gasped and dropped the reel. The lights came back on. Nothing was behind me, and I felt no pressure anymore, but my skin was clammy. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I stood there breathing hard, trying not to panic. I decided I couldn't handle it alone. I tried explaining the situation to a friend, but he just laughed and said basements can be creepy. He suggested I install better lighting and maybe a security camera. The idea made sense, so I set up a small camera that records when it detects motion. I aimed it at the work area, pointing at the tripod, the table, and the wall behind me. It made me feel a little safer, though I still felt that knot in my stomach every time I turned off the overhead light and switched on the red lamp. I let the camera run for a couple of nights. Then I reviewed the footage. Most of it was me moving back and forth, picking up photos, adjusting the chemicals. But around 2 minutes into the second night session, I saw the tripod shift about half an inch to the left without anyone touching it. There was no one else in the frame. I rewound the footage a few times, thinking maybe I bumped it, but my hands never went near it. The camera showed me standing at the table, my back turned. The tripod just slid a bit, like someone nudged it. I watched the rest of the recording, feeling my pulse race. Nothing else happened, but that was enough for me to feel my face get hot and my breath get shallow. Since then, I've tried to go down there as little as possible. But I still need to develop film if I want to keep shooting the way I do. Every time I walk in, I keep one eye on the tripod and one eye on my gear. I set up a routine, turn on the red lamp, check the chemicals, keep my phone handy in case I freak out, then start developing. I listen for any sound. I keep the camera running. I try not to think about the shadow that keeps appearing in my photos. Last night, I went down with a fresh roll of film from a shoot I did outside an old warehouse. I turned on the red lamp, and the basement felt colder than usual. The dehumidifier was off. I pressed the power button, but nothing happened. I fiddled with the plug. Still nothing. I shrugged it off and started working. The water in the developing tank felt colder than normal against my fingers. The smell of chemicals seemed stronger too. My eyes stung a bit. I heard a faint clicking noise from the corner, like someone tapping metal. I tried to tune it out. My heart was beating fast and I was sweating. Halfway through the process, the lights flickered again. 3 quick pulses. Then the overhead bulb in the outer area of the basement turned on by itself. I know I didn't switch it on. I saw the glow reflecting off the concrete wall. My chest felt tight and I got dizzy for a moment. I kept telling myself it was the wiring, that maybe I had left the switch in some halfway position. But that didn't help me relax. I walked toward the door to shut off the overhead light. As I reached it, I heard a scraping sound right behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight on the tripod. It was angled differently again. My hand was shaking. I couldn't move for a few seconds. I just stared at the tripod, waiting for it to move again. Nothing else happened right then. I turned off the overhead light, made sure everything was secure, and finished developing as quickly as possible. When I got upstairs, I locked the basement door and leaned against it. I was breathing fast and I could feel my shirt sticking to my back. I glanced at the time on my phone. It was only 10 at night. I felt like I had been down there for hours. I went to my living room, closed all the curtains, and just sat, trying to calm myself. I keep telling myself that this is all in my head, that maybe I'm jumping at every little sound, but the negatives in the camera footage don't lie. Something is in that basement with me. I don't know what it is, but I feel it every time I step inside. My body reacts before my mind can come up with excuses. My skin prickles, and my heart tries to hammer its way out of my chest. Now I'm at a point where I need to make a decision. I could seal up the dark room, keep my gear upstairs, and mail my film to a lab like everyone else. Or I can try to get some answers. Part of me wants to set up more cameras and maybe a voice recorder. Another part of me wants to tear the dark room down and pretend none of this ever happened. Every time I think about going down there, I feel my stomach knot up, and I start to sweat. But I can't just walk away from something that seems to demand attention. That's why I'm here upstairs, writing this all out with the basement door locked behind me. The house is quiet. I hear the fridge humming in the kitchen. My lights are on, and my phone is right next to me. I feel safer up here. But there's a small voice in the back of my mind telling me that I can't ignore what's happening in the basement. The question is whether I'm brave or foolish enough to keep investigating. Right now, I'm not sure which I am. All I know is that the next time I walk down those stairs, I'll be listening for every click, every scrape, and every shift in the air. And I'll be watching my tripod like a hawk, hoping it stays exactly where I left it. If it doesn't, I might finally decide that enough is enough. But until then, I can't stop looking over my shoulder, and I can't shake the feeling that something is looking right back. I never expected an old toolbox to make me lose sleep. At first, I was just happy to have a bunch of decent tools for my home repairs. Then I started hearing noises. Now, every night, I lie in bed with my eyes open, waiting for that metallic scraping to start again. This is what happened. My uncle moved overseas about a month ago. Before he left, he dropped off a wooden toolbox at my place. He was in a hurry. He said, "Here, I don't need these where I'm going." Then he left for the airport. I lifted the box and felt the weight. It was heavy. I heard metal clinking inside. I shrugged and brought it into my garage. I remember placing it on my old workbench near the back wall. The wood felt rough, and the hinges squeaked when I opened it. Inside were some open-end wrenches, a few pairs of pliers, and a hammer that looked worn out. The handle had dark stains, and the head was chipped along the edges. I didn't think much of it. I like fixing things, so I was happy to add these tools to my collection. I took out the wrenches, gave them a quick wipe, then put them back in the box. I noticed the hammer's handle had little splinters along the grain. It felt strange in my hand, so I put it aside and moved on with my night. That was day one. Around midnight, I heard this weird scraping sound. I was half asleep. At first, I thought it was just a stray cat outside, or maybe the wind. But it kept going, a slow, drawn-out screech of metal. I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. I headed to the garage in my slippers. When I turned on the light, everything looked normal. The toolbox was there. The tools were inside. The only odd thing was my ladder leaned slightly off the wall. I adjusted it, turned off the light, and went back to bed. I tried to forget about it. The next morning, I found the hammer on the workbench. I swore I left it in the box. I picked it up, looked around, and wondered if maybe I had absent-mindedly left it out. I decided I must have. I placed it back into the box and went to make breakfast. That night, around 11:30 p.m., I started hearing scraping again. This time, it sounded more like metal tapping, like a tool hitting concrete. I felt a chill in my chest. It wasn't that cold in the room, but my arms had goosebumps. I grabbed my flashlight again and made my way to the garage. I opened the door, clicked the light switch, and stared. The hammer was standing on its head, balanced against the corner of the workbench. I stood there, silent, for a good 10 seconds. My pulse picked up, and I felt a drop of sweat run down the side of my face. I walked over and picked up the hammer. I checked the box. Everything else seemed in place. The wrenches were stacked, the pliers were inside. I placed the hammer in the box, shut the lid, and went back inside. I locked the door behind me. For a moment, I considered the possibility of someone messing with me. Maybe a neighbor had a key, but that made no sense. My garage door was locked, and the windows were intact. The only other entrance was the door to my hallway. I went to bed feeling uneasy, but I tried to block it out. On the third night, I heard a loud bang. It sounded like metal hitting wood with force. My eyes opened wide. My heart started racing. I grabbed the flashlight again. My feet felt heavy as I walked to the garage door. I opened it carefully, flipped on the light, and found the hammer resting on the bench with its handle pointing right at the door. I looked around for any sign of forced entry. Nothing. No broken windows, no footprints, no damage on the door. I stood there, swallowing hard, feeling my mouth go dry. I decided to lock the hammer in one of my tool drawers. I had a drawer with a simple metal latch. I put the hammer in there and closed it tight. I said out loud, "Enough of this," though I don't know who I was talking to. My voice felt shaky. I walked out, locked the garage door, and went to my bedroom. In the morning, I went to check. The drawer was wide open. The latch was undone, no damage at all, and the hammer sat right on the workbench again. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline in my arms. My hand trembled. I picked up the hammer and turned it over. The handle looked slightly darker than before, but that might have been my imagination. I swallowed, took a deep breath, and tried not to think too hard about it. I closed the toolbox and carried it to a different spot in the garage. I placed it in a cabinet near the door. I locked the cabinet. That night, I paced around my living room, unable to relax. I turned on the TV, but the volume felt too loud. Every few minutes, I muted the television, trying to hear if there was any noise. Around 12:15, I heard a faint tapping. It was consistent, like someone knocking on a wall. I realized it came from the garage. My skin felt clammy. I grabbed the flashlight. My breath was quick and shallow. I opened the garage door, turned on the overhead light, and looked around. The cabinet door was open and the toolbox was on the floor. The hammer lay on top of the box, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. I walked over slowly. My legs felt weak. I was alert, looking for movement in the corners. I saw nothing out of the ordinary except for the tools. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry, and my voice sounded shaky. "Is anyone here?" No answer. The air smelled a bit musty, like old metal and dust. The entire time I felt a tightness in my chest. I decided to carry the hammer to the far side of the garage. I put it on a shelf, behind some paint cans. Then I dragged an old suitcase in front of the shelf, just to block it. I left the toolbox on the workbench and locked up again. I went inside, made a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock. For an hour, I waited. No noises. I tried to calm down, but my leg kept bouncing under the table. I felt shaky. My heart rate stayed high. The next morning, the hammer was back on the workbench. The paint cans were knocked over and the suitcase had been moved a few inches. This time, I felt a surge of anger. I cursed under my breath and approached the bench. I looked at the hammer. I saw dust on the head and a few tiny chips of paint near the handle. I picked it up and put it back in the toolbox. Then I walked away. I spent the rest of the day trying to occupy myself with chores around the house. I kept thinking about the possibility of someone sneaking in, but the doors stayed locked. Nothing was missing, except my sense of safety. That night, I went to bed early, around 2 a.m. A noise startled me awake. It sounded like nails scraping across the concrete floor in the garage. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. I got up, heart pounding, and stepped into my slippers. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the garage door, but I froze before touching the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I just stood there, breathing fast, my hand shaking. Then I twisted the knob and flipped on the light. The toolbox was open. A pair of pliers lay on the floor. The hammer was on the workbench again. I walked up to the bench, crouched down to pick up the pliers, and felt a sudden rush of cold air, like a draft. My skin prickled. My eyes darted around, but I saw no windows open. I placed the pliers back in the box and slammed the lid shut. Then I stood there, breathing hard, waiting to see if anything moved. Nothing did, but I felt watched, like someone stood right behind me. I swung around, flashlight in hand, shining it into the corners behind boxes under the table. No one was there. I locked the toolbox, put a small padlock on the latch, and walked out. When I woke the next day, I rushed to the garage to check. The padlock was still on the box, but the hammer lay on the floor next to the workbench. I stared at the locked box. My chest felt tight. The key was still in my pocket. There was no damage to the padlock. I had no explanation. I leaned against the wall, eyes on the hammer, breathing through my mouth because my nose felt congested with anxiety. I decided to gather all the tools and store them in the trunk of my car. I lifted the box with the hammer inside. The box felt lighter than I expected. I paused. Then I realized the hammer was not inside it, so of course it was lighter. I grabbed the hammer and tossed it in the box. I locked the padlock and took everything to my car. Then I drove to a storage facility a few miles away and rented a small locker. I put the toolbox in there, locked the unit, and drove home. For a moment I felt relief. I came back to my garage. It looked empty. My workbench was cleared. The air smelled normal. I stepped around carefully, almost expecting to hear a clang or a scratch. Nothing. That night I slept without hearing anything unusual. The next morning was calm. No tools out of place. No tapping. The garage stayed silent. But on the second night after storing the toolbox away, I woke up around 3 a.m. I heard it again. Metal scraping against the concrete floor. My heart lurched. I sat up in bed, feeling my muscles tense. My palms were sweaty. I got up and walked to the garage door. I opened it, turned on the light, and froze. The hammer was on the bench again. No sign of forced entry, no footprints on the floor. I stared at it. My heart felt like it was going to burst. I said, "This is impossible." I checked my car trunk, empty. I checked the corners of the garage, nothing there. I stood next to the workbench, feeling my stomach tighten, my mind racing with questions. I haven't returned to the storage unit yet. I can't explain how the hammer came back. I haven't seen my uncle since he left. I tried calling him, but his number goes straight to voicemail. I'm not sure what I would even say. Your toolbox is haunted. Sounds ridiculous. But every night I hear it. Every night I open the garage door and I see that hammer sitting out in the open waiting for me. I moved the bench. I used a new lock on the door. Nothing helps. I feel the presence every time I walk into that space. My chest tightens, my breathing goes shaky, and I get dizzy. I haven't told anyone else. Part of me feels embarrassed. Part of me is afraid they won't believe me. Right now, the hammer is on the floor, near my steps leading into the house. I can see it from where I'm standing. I try to ignore it. I have a strong urge to grab it and throw it away, but I'm also afraid to touch it. I'm afraid to make things worse. I feel cornered by an object that shouldn't have any power at all. I stand here listening for the next scrape, the next clang of metal. My mouth is dry and my hands are shaking. I stare at the hammer. I wonder if it's staring back. I don't know how to end this. I don't have a solution. Every time I lock that thing away, it returns. Every time I try to ignore it, it pulls me back. It makes me feel watched. It makes me sweat. It makes my heart pound so hard that I have trouble breathing. I don't hear voices, but I sense someone in the room. I sense a weight on my shoulders like I'm not alone. I can't describe it in fancy terms or with pretty words. It just scares me, and I don't know what to do. Tonight I might take the hammer to a scrapyard and leave it there. I might dump it in the trash outside of town. I'm desperate. I want my life back. I want to walk into my garage without feeling a knot in my stomach. I want to sleep through the night without waking up soaked in sweat, listening for a scraping sound that makes my hair stand on end. I can't live with this toolbox anymore. I can't keep checking that bench for signs of movement. I can't keep feeling my chest tighten every time a pipe rattles or the wind blows. I'm writing this now, standing in my garage with the lights on, trying not to look at that hammer. I hear small clicks from the corner. I feel my legs trembling. If I pick it up, I'll feel its worn handle and chipped head. If I walk away, it'll still be here tomorrow. I don't know if I can leave it behind, but I know I can't stay like this. My uncle left me this problem, and I want it gone. I'm about to wrap it in an old rag, carry it to my truck, and drive. I don't care where I take it, I just need it out of my life. That's the last thing I can think of to do. If it comes back again after that, I don't know what else to try. I'm scared out of my mind. I just want to be free from this hammer, and I want to stop hearing these noises at night. I hate walking through that parking lot at night. Every time I step onto that cold concrete, I get this rush of unease. The air feels heavier, like it's pressing down on me. I can't explain it well, but I know something is off. It's not just my imagination, because I've heard other people mention it too, even if they won't say much when I'm around. They make small comments like, "Yeah, that place is creepy," or "I don't like parking too far out." I always shrugged it off until I started noticing things myself. I work at a factory in an industrial zone. My shift usually starts around 9 at night and ends a little before sunrise, depending on overtime or equipment issues. The parking lot is huge. The lights on the poles are spaced out, and there are spots where the darkness settles in thick layers. You can't see much in those corners unless you shine a flashlight or walk right up to them. I used to park my car near one of those lampposts, but lately I've been parking closer to the entrance. I'm not sure it makes a difference, but it feels a bit safer. I first realized something was wrong a few weeks ago. I remember that night clearly because it was strangely quiet in the factory. The machines were running, but the usual chatter was missing. People seemed more focused on getting their job done and less on socializing. When my shift ended, I headed out to the parking lot alone. The air was chilly and the wind was blowing dust around. There was this faint scraping sound against the concrete, like someone dragging their feet. I thought it might be my shoes at first, so I stopped walking, but the sound continued. Then it stopped a second later, like whoever, or whatever, was making it noticed I was listening. I tried to peer between the rows of parked cars, but I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The overhead lights were too dim and the shadows felt thicker than usual. I had this overwhelming urge to hurry, so I started walking faster. I was maybe a dozen yards away from my car when I felt like someone was watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My chest tightened and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I looked around again. Nothing. I told myself I was just jumpy. As I got closer to the driver's side door, I noticed something move on the other side of my car. It was a black shape, low to the ground. I could see part of a shoulder or an arm, maybe. I froze. My heart was beating so loud I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. I waited for a moment, hoping to see some sign that it was just a coworker messing around. But the shape disappeared behind another car, smoothly and without a sound. That's what got me the most. It moved so silently. I unlocked my car, jumped inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking while I fumbled for the keys. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something pop up behind me, but the lot looked empty. Then I started the engine and drove off. As I pulled out, I scanned the area once more. The overhead lights barely did anything, and I couldn't spot the shape again. I told myself it must have been some trick of the shadows, but I didn't believe it. The next night I parked in a different spot, closer to the entrance, hoping I'd feel better. But around midnight I had to take a break and head outside to grab something from my car. The hallway leading out had a metal door with a small glass window, and when I looked through it I got a clear view of part of the parking lot. I saw movement between the cars just for a second. It looked like a figure darting from one row to another. I thought it might be a security guard doing rounds, so I waited. But no one else came in through that door. No one knocked or opened it. There was no sign of a uniform, no flashlight beam, nothing that would indicate it was official security. I went back inside and mentioned to a coworker that I could have sworn I saw someone outside. He barely looked up from his phone and said, "Yeah, sometimes you see weird stuff out there. Probably just your eyes playing tricks." I didn't push the conversation further, but I could tell he was avoiding it. I wondered if he'd had his own encounters but didn't want to talk about it. That same coworker left before me. When I clocked out, I heard the door shut behind me, and the night air rushed in again. It was a little warmer than the night before, but the darkness felt the same. Thick, oppressive. I headed out to my car, trying to keep my breathing steady. My footsteps echoed. I heard another sound like footsteps a few beats behind mine, so I stopped walking. Everything went silent. I started walking again, and again I heard that same timing. Step, step, step behind me. I spun around. There was nobody in sight. I hurried to my car and threw open the door. As I did, I heard a faint scraping along the ground behind the vehicle. It was like someone was crouched low, brushing their shoes against the concrete. I got inside, locked the doors, and gripped the steering wheel. My heart was pounding. I thought, drive. Just drive. So I turned the key, put the car in gear, and left. All the way home, I kept looking in the mirrors. My palms were sweaty, and my shirt clung to my back. I felt that lingering sensation that I wasn't alone, even though the car was empty. In the days that followed, I tried to ignore it. I focused on my tasks at work, operating the machines, doing quality checks, talking to my supervisor about deadlines. I told myself I was probably stressed and imagining things. But each night, the walk back to my car became more tense. I started carrying a small flashlight and shining it between rows of cars, hoping to catch whoever might be out there. A few times I saw a flash of movement, a foot sliding behind a tire or a shape dipping out of sight. Whenever I ran toward it, I found nothing. One particular night, I was so on edge that I couldn't bring myself to leave right away. My shift ended at 3 in the morning, but I stayed inside until almost 4, hoping the feeling would go away. When I finally stepped outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. Only a few cars remained, scattered in the dim glow of the streetlights. I stayed close to the building at first, shining my flashlight along the ground. I didn't see anything. I walked toward my car with the flashlight pointed ahead. About halfway there, the beam landed on a pair of shoes peeking out from behind another car. They were black, scuffed, and facing my direction. Then they moved back, out of the light. My heart started hammering in my chest. I shouted, "Hey, who's there?" No answer. I approached the spot quickly, my flashlight swinging around. Nothing. No one was behind that car. I glanced under the nearby vehicles, saw nothing but concrete and shadows. My hands were shaking again. I got back on my feet and hurried to my car, got in, locked the doors. That was the first time I almost considered calling the police. But what would I say? That I saw some shoes in the shadows. I wasn't even sure I'd get a proper response. So I just left. After that night, I started feeling dread before my shift even began. I could handle the work. The machines didn't scare me. The long hours, the clanking, the possibility of getting a hand caught in a press, those were risks I knew. But this was different. It felt personal, like something was out there, waiting for me. I told myself it could be a trespasser or maybe a homeless person hiding out in the lot. But why would they keep following me, moving from row to row? I asked a few coworkers casually, "Hey, have you noticed anything weird out there at night?" One of them, a guy named Mark, shifted uneasily and said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm not alone, but I've never actually seen anything." Another coworker, Tony, just nodded when I brought it up. Then he changed the subject, as if he didn't want to discuss it. That only made me more suspicious that something was really happening, and we just weren't sure how to handle it. I couldn't shake the tension. Each night around midnight, I felt this pit in my stomach. I'd catch myself thinking about the parking lot. When the shift ended, I'd wrap up my things in a hurry. The moment the clock hit the end of my shift, I wanted to run to my car, but I also knew I had to pace myself, or I'd seem paranoid. Sometimes I'd walk out in a group, hoping it would stop that feeling, but even then I'd still sense that presence or hear a faint rustling in the distance. Nobody else pointed it out in front of me, but the looks on their faces told me they felt it too. One night about a week ago, I had a close call. I was leaving after some overtime, so it was nearly 5 in the morning. The sky had a faint glow from the approaching sunrise, but the lot was still mostly dark. As I approached my car, I thought I saw someone crouching between it and the car next to mine. This time, I decided to be more direct. I squared my shoulders and walked around slowly, shining my flashlight at the ground. My heart was thumping so hard I felt it in my throat. When I reached the back of my car, I heard a sharp inhale like someone gasping for breath. I swung the flashlight in that direction, and I caught a glimpse of a face. It was pale, with wide eyes, staring right at me. Then it vanished. There was no time for me to process it. I jumped, nearly dropped the flashlight, and stumbled back. I circled around quickly, trying to see where this person went. But by the time I reached the other side, there was nothing but darkness. My stomach was in knots. My legs felt unsteady, like they might give out. I got into my car and slammed the door. I stayed there for a few seconds, panting, trying to steady my hands. I remember thinking, that was a real person. That wasn't just a shadow. My skin felt clammy and I was sweating despite the cool air. I drove home in a near panic, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. I couldn't get that face out of my head. I started wondering if I should report it, but I had no description beyond that white face and those startled eyes. It could have been anyone. I didn't see any distinguishing features and I had no idea what they were doing. Maybe it was someone looking for valuables in the cars. But why keep lurking out there night after night, barely seen? Why the scraping footsteps and the silent movements? Since then, I've changed my routine. I try to leave at the same time as other coworkers and walk out with at least one or two people. I don't like walking out alone. When I do have to go alone, I keep my flashlight out and my keys in my hand. The tension hits me the moment I push open that metal door. The wind outside always feels a little too cold and the shadows look a little too thick. My heart rate goes up. My jaw tightens. I look around constantly, trying to catch the slightest movement. I see my breath in the air when it's cold. I hear the hum of the distant traffic on the main road, the clicking of the security camera on the side of the building, the faint buzzing from the overhead lights. And underneath it all, I keep thinking I'm hearing footsteps. They never sync perfectly with mine. They always seem to come a step or two after, like whoever it is wants me to know they're there, but not see them. When I finally reach my car, I unlock it, fling the door open, get in, and lock it immediately. I check the mirrors. I turn on the interior light for a second, scanning the back seat. I don't see anyone. Then I start the engine, usually with my hands shaking. My chest feels tight and my mouth goes dry. If I see any movement around me, I freeze for a moment. But then I force myself to back out and leave. By the time I hit the main road, my whole body is tense, and I can't breathe right until I'm a few miles away. I've been thinking about switching to a day shift or finding another job. But the money here is good, and day positions aren't always available. Plus, I feel like if I give in and leave, I'll never know what's really going on in that parking lot. Part of me wants to catch whoever is out there, just to put an end to this feeling. Another part of me wants to forget it all and move on. Now, every night, I mentally prepare for that walk to the car. I tell myself to stay calm and keep my eyes open. But no matter how many times I do it, the fear doesn't go away. There's always a split second just before I open my car door, when I'm convinced there's someone on the other side of the vehicle, waiting for me to let my guard down. I imagine a face suddenly rising up in the window, staring at me through the glass. I start to breathe faster. My muscles tense, and I feel that wave of panic rolling in. I haven't seen that pale face again, but I sense it could appear at any moment. And each time I drive home, I keep expecting to see something in my rear-view mirror. Sometimes I even catch myself checking the back seat more than once at stoplights, worried I might have missed someone crouching there. I'm not sleeping well either. I wake up a few times during the day thinking I hear the scraping footsteps outside my window. But it's just my mind playing tricks. I don't know how this will end. I don't know if I'll ever confront whoever is lurking out there. Maybe it's an actual person. Maybe it's multiple people. Or maybe it's just some stray drifter who wanders through the lot. All I know is that I dread my shift ending. I dread that long walk across the concrete under those weak lights between rows of shadowy cars. And the worst part is, I feel like this isn't over. Every time I step onto that parking lot, I brace myself for the next strange sight or sound. And so far, it keeps happening. I just hope it never gets any worse than it already is. I picked up that short-term job in a coastal town because I wanted a change of pace. I was tired of my old routine, and I figured a few months near a wide stretch of beach would give me some quiet time. I was wrong. I'm telling this story because it still keeps me on edge. I can't shake the things I heard at night or the strange feeling that followed me around those deserted shores. Every time I recall it, my stomach tightens and my palms get sweaty. I haven't talked much about it, but I need to get it out. The place was about a 3-hour drive from my hometown. The town itself looked normal when I arrived. There was a long main street with small shops on each side and a big grocery store about half a mile from the beach. The roads were mostly empty, except for a few cars parked near a small diner. The buildings looked faded, maybe because the salty air had been hitting them for years. I arrived at midday, parked my old car, and grabbed my bags. I didn't see many people walking around. I only spotted a couple of elderly folks sitting outside a convenience store sipping drinks. They barely glanced in my direction. I had already arranged a small studio 2 blocks from the beach. The landlord told me it was furnished and the rent was cheap. When I stood in front of it, I noticed chipped paint on the walls and some rust on the metal fence around the tiny yard. Still, I was happy to have a place so close to the ocean. I walked in and found a narrow living space with a kitchenette in the corner. There was a flimsy table near the window and a small sofa bed against the opposite wall. The floorboards creaked when I set down my bags. The smell of salt water hung in the air, even with the windows closed. I opened one of them to let in some fresh air, but the breeze that came in felt humid and left a slight sticky feeling on my skin. That first afternoon, I just unpacked and then went to pick up some groceries. The job wouldn't start for another day, so I had time to settle in. I brought back a few items to stock the fridge. After setting everything up, I decided to walk down to the shore. I wanted to see what the beach looked like up close. As soon as I got outside, I heard the distant crash of waves. The sky was overcast, and there wasn't much light, but I could still make out the line of the shoreline up ahead. When I reached the sand, I realized how empty the area was. The beach stretched in both directions with a few large rock formations jutting out near the water. I saw some seagulls hopping around, picking at something near the tide line, but I didn't see anyone else. I stood there for a minute and listened to the waves. They rolled in steadily. My shoes sank a little in the damp sand, and my nose filled with the strong smell of salt. I felt a slight chill from the breeze coming off the water. After a while, I walked back to my place. I planned to get up early the next day and figure out the route to my temporary job site. That night, I slept fine, although I did notice a faint dripping sound outside my window around midnight. I thought it was just water from the gutters or maybe something left behind by the rain that had fallen earlier. I forced myself to ignore it and went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to dull sunlight filtering through the blinds. My first day at work was uneventful. I was mostly running errands and organizing inventory. My supervisor was a quiet man in his 50s. He showed me around the small warehouse, explained my tasks, and then let me get on with it. At lunchtime, I sat alone on a bench behind the building. I could smell the ocean even there, a few blocks away. My coworker, a guy named Dave, nodded at me on his way out, but we didn't talk. The day ended and I headed home thinking I would take another walk on the beach after dinner. That evening, I heated up a frozen meal and ate in front of the open window. I could see a slice of sky with dark clouds moving slowly. A gust of wind blew in and I got goosebumps on my arms. My plan was to walk along the shore, then come back and crash. But when I stepped outside, something felt off. There wasn't anyone else on the street. The air felt heavy and the wind died down, leaving everything too quiet. I headed to the beach anyway, thinking it would relax me. The moment I reached the sand, I heard something behind me. At first, it sounded like soft footsteps matching my own. I stopped and turned around. Nobody was there. The beach stretched out in either direction. There were no houses on the immediate beachfront, just dunes and some beach grass. The only visible structures were a few lifeguard towers in the distance. I thought maybe I was tired, so I shrugged it off and kept walking. A few seconds later, I heard the footsteps again. They seemed to sync with mine, stopping when I stopped, moving when I moved. My heart rate went up and I scanned the area for any sign of someone else. Still nothing. I tried walking faster, but the sound continued. I thought about calling out, but I felt silly. Instead, I turned around once more and took a few quick steps backward, keeping my eyes on the empty sand. I didn't see anyone. The waves kept crashing, steady and loud. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I decided I'd had enough for one night, so I jogged back to my building. The footsteps didn't follow me once I left the beach. By the time I reached my door, my pulse was racing and my breath came in short bursts. Inside, I locked everything. I double-checked the windows. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, maybe some echo of my own steps, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next couple of days went by without much happening. I stuck to working, buying groceries, and staying in. I skipped my walks on the beach because I felt that same nagging discomfort whenever I thought about going out at night. On the fourth evening, though, I decided to try again. I wanted to prove to myself that I was just being paranoid. I left my place around 9. The streetlights flickered in the breeze. A distant streetlight buzzed softly, giving off a weak glow. As I got closer to the shore, I smelled the salt in the air again, strong enough to make my nose tingle. I stepped onto the sand and took a deep breath. The tide was low and a wide stretch of wet sand shimmered under the moonlight. I walked toward the water. After a few minutes, I heard that same pattern of footsteps. They matched the tempo of my own steps. I spun around and all I saw was my shadow cast by the half-lit moon. My skin prickled, and I felt sweat forming at the back of my neck. My heart pounded hard. I wanted to shout, but my throat felt tight. I told myself I was hearing echoes. Maybe the hollow space under the boardwalk or something like that was causing it. But then I realized there was no boardwalk here. It was just open beach and dunes. I walked a little farther, keeping my eyes fixed on the area behind me. My chest felt heavy, and each breath seemed too loud. The footsteps persisted for a few moments and then they stopped. I stayed still, waiting, with my hands trembling at my sides. The sound didn't come back. I turned around to continue, but then I heard a splash in the water. It wasn't a gentle wave. It sounded more like someone stepping into the ocean. I tried to see who it was, but there was no one visible near the waterline. I backed away, feeling my heart beat in my ears. My thoughts raced. I was alone out there. I couldn't see any sign of another person. The ocean looked dark, with faint reflections of the moon on the surface. I decided to go home. I walked quickly, trying not to break into a run, but my muscles felt tense. Once I got back to my street, I noticed a damp patch on the sidewalk, like water had pooled there. But the sky was clear. I noticed droplets trailing off into a side alley. It was strange. I shook my head and went inside. That night I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing dripping sounds on my small balcony. I checked outside once, expecting to see a leaking pipe, but everything looked dry. Still, the smell of the ocean was overwhelming. It even overpowered the musty odor of the old couch. I felt a headache forming, so I took a painkiller and managed to drift off. My dreams were filled with the sound of waves and the sight of empty sand under a cloudy sky. I woke up more tired than when I'd gone to bed. My job went on as normal the next day. I tried to keep my mind busy by going through files, labeling boxes, and reorganizing supplies in the storeroom. Dave invited me to have a quick coffee with him. I wanted to ask him if he'd ever experienced anything weird on the beach at night, but I didn't want him to think I was losing it. So I just sipped my coffee and made small talk. He mentioned that the town got pretty quiet in the off-season, and that most tourists only came during the summer. I nodded, pretending I didn't feel uneasy about the empty beach. A few nights later, I decided to stay out on the shore a bit later. Part of me wanted answers. Another part wanted to prove I wasn't scared. I waited until almost 11 before I left my studio. The night sky was almost black, with just a few faint stars. The wind was colder than usual, and I zipped up my jacket. My ears felt numb after a few minutes, so I stuffed my hands in my pockets. I walked down to the sand, staying close to the spot where I usually entered the beach. The moonlight was weak, but I could see well enough to avoid stepping into a tide pool. I walked along, scanning the area near the rocks. That's when I spotted a silhouette. It was a man, standing perfectly still, facing the water. His figure was just a dark outline against the faint glow of the moon. He stood near a cluster of rocks, where the waves would sometimes crash. I stopped, my heart pounding. I opened my mouth to call out, but I felt a knot in my throat. I forced the words out, something like, "Hello? Hey." The man didn't move. He stayed there, facing the water. I decided to walk closer. My pulse throbbed in my neck and my legs felt stiff. Each step made a crunch in the wet sand. I got about 20 feet away. The man's shape was still. I couldn't see his face or clothes in detail. The ocean hissed around the rocks, spraying water into the air. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind rushed over me. It cut through my jacket and made me shiver. A strong smell of salt filled my nose, almost burning my nostrils. I shielded my face with one hand, squinting at the sudden force of it. When I looked back, the silhouette was gone. It didn't walk away. It just wasn't there anymore. I froze, staring at the empty spot. The only sounds were the water crashing and my own breathing. My hands were trembling, and I felt a wave of nausea. My mind raced with possibilities. I wondered if he had hidden behind a rock. I scanned the area, stepping forward, but there was no sign of him. I backed away, my feet unsteady. I turned and half ran, half stumbled across the beach. My lungs felt tight and every breath seemed to scratch my throat. I reached the street and noticed my vision was blurred by tears from the cold wind. I forced myself to calm down before I went inside my building. Once I made it to my studio, I locked the door behind me. I pressed my back to the wall and let out a shaky breath. My muscles felt weak, and I sank to the floor. My clothes smelled strongly of salt, like I had been standing too close to the waves. I looked out the window, but I couldn't see the ocean from there. I kept hearing the faint drip on the balcony. My stomach churned. I glanced at the clock and saw it was almost midnight. I took a long shower, letting the hot water run over me, but I still felt uneasy. That night, I barely slept. I woke up every hour, convinced I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. From that point on, I couldn't ignore the odd sensations. The dripping on my balcony would start up randomly. Sometimes it was around 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. I'd get up, check outside, and see nothing but a wet spot on the concrete. The strong smell of the ocean seemed even more intense, especially in the early morning hours. It filled my studio, clung to my clothes, and got into my nose so much that I tasted salt when I swallowed. I tried to avoid walking on the beach at night, but my curiosity kept pushing me. I thought maybe I could catch that man again. One evening I stood on my balcony around dusk, watching the horizon. The sky was gray, and the ocean looked dark. I couldn't see anything unusual from my vantage point. I told myself I'd go down just to take a quick look, stay near the entrance, and come right back. So I pulled on my jacket and headed out. I walked slowly, glancing around every few steps. The streets were empty. Most houses had their lights off. I reached the sand and looked around. There were no footprints except for mine. The ocean roared in the distance. I felt my legs tense up. I stood there for a minute, then I turned around and left. I didn't want to push my luck. I got home, locked up, and tried to distract myself by reading the local newspaper. But I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting to the window. The night passed without any new sounds, but I still felt jumpy. A few more days went by, and my job ended. My contract was for a short period, so my time in town was almost up. I spent my final day cleaning the studio and packing my things. I returned the key to the landlord and mentioned the strange dripping outside at night. He shrugged and said something about pipes sweating due to the salty air. He didn't seem to care. I loaded my car with my bags and glanced at the beach one last time from the end of the street. The wind carried that strong sea smell again, almost making me gag. I drove away, feeling both relieved and unsettled. Even now, I still think about those footsteps matching mine on the sand. I remember the cold wind cutting through me and the silhouette by the rocks. I hear those drips in the middle of the night sometimes, like an echo in my head. I don't know if that man was real, or if something else was lurking on those deserted shores. All I know is that my time there wasn't the relaxing break I expected. It filled me with a kind of tension I can't forget. Even at home, miles from that ocean, I sometimes wake up in the dark, my heart pounding, and I smell that salty air. Then I wonder if it's following me. I've never liked that back porch. It's at the end of a narrow hallway in my single-story house, and the glass door leading out there almost always sticks. I moved in a few years ago and never bothered with that area much. It felt musty, and the door had a habit of jamming in the frame. I mostly stayed away. I'd go out to sweep once in a while, but I left it alone for the most part. That all changed recently, and now I find myself looking over my shoulder every time I pass that hallway. I decided last week to clean the porch. It was a random decision. I'd been out there maybe a handful of times since I bought the place. The floor had leaves and dust all over it, and the door's track was full of debris. I figured I'd give it a good scrub and finally see if I could get the door working better. I put on some old clothes and grabbed a broom, a mop, some rags, and a bucket of soapy water. The door stuck as usual, and I had to yank it hard to slide it open. The musty smell hit me right away, like old socks mixed with wet wood. I stepped inside and saw the entire porch was a mess. The windows looked grimy. The screens had cobwebs in the corners. The tiled floor felt damp and gritty under my shoes. In the back corner, I saw a piece of furniture. It was a single chair, looked like an old armchair or something similar. There was mold on the edges of the upholstery, and a thick layer of dust made it look almost gray. I had no idea it was there. I assumed maybe the previous owners left it behind. I started cleaning, sweeping up leaves and wiping the windows. I spent a couple of hours just getting rid of dirt and grime. I moved around the perimeter of the room, then finally got to the corner with the chair. The fabric looked stained. One arm had a tear with stuffing popping out. The other arm looked like it had a dark patch of mold. I touched it lightly and felt the fabric crumble under my fingers. It was damp. The smell was worse near the chair, like mildew. I wiped it down the best I could, then let it air out. I didn't bother trying to move it that day because I was already exhausted. I spent extra time cleaning the door's track and spraying it with a lubricant. After I finished, I closed everything up, left the chair where it was, and went back into the main house. I showered and forgot about it. Later that night, I heard a squeaking sound. I was in my living room watching a show. I paused the TV and listened. The sound was faint, like something shifting or rocking against a hard surface. My living room shares a wall with that porch, so I thought maybe it was the windows or a branch outside. But then I realized it sounded closer. It was a slow, steady squeak that made me think of an old rocking chair. But I knew there was no rocking chair out there, just that musty armchair. I stood up and walked over to the hallway. The light was off, so I switched it on and looked toward the glass door. The squeaking stopped. I stared for a moment, feeling a slight tug of unease. The door was closed, but I could see the outline of the porch in the dim light that filtered through. The armchair was in the corner. I didn't see any movement. Everything looked still. I shrugged it off, turned off the hallway light, and went back to the couch. As soon as I got comfortable again, I heard the squeak. It was the same sound, a gentle groaning as if weight was settling onto a piece of furniture. My stomach tightened. I grabbed a small flashlight I keep on the coffee table, walked back down the hallway, and flipped the switch again. The squeaking was still there. I slid the door open. It moved a bit easier now, though it still caught in the frame. I stepped onto the porch. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Even though I'd cleaned, there was a damp odor everywhere. I scanned the area with the flashlight. The windows were closed. The chair was where I'd left it, near the back wall, but I swore the armchair was moving. It wasn't a big motion, just a gentle shift, like someone had just leaned back and let it tilt. I walked closer. My pulse thudded in my ears. I aimed the flashlight at the seat cushion. It looked slightly depressed, as if someone had just gotten up. The fabric had an indentation. My mouth went dry, and I ran my hand over the cushion. It felt warm, like body heat lingering in a bed after someone's been lying there. I jumped back. My heart was hammering in my chest. I couldn't see anything else unusual. The windows were locked. The door had been closed. I reached out and tried to push the chair across the floor, but it wouldn't budge. It felt way heavier than it should be. It didn't slide. I had to put real effort into it to move it a few inches. The legs screeched against the tiles, and I felt a burst of anxiety. I left it there and hurried back inside, locking the glass door behind me. That night, I hardly slept. My mind kept replaying the feeling of that warm fabric. I live alone, and I don't have people coming over often. There's no reason that chair should have been warm. I tried telling myself there was some weird heat source, maybe a pipe underneath the porch or something, but that didn't explain why it felt like it had the shape of a person. The next day, I opened the porch door again, determined to check the area in daylight. I walked around and inspected each window. None were broken. I tried to see if there were any vents that blew warm air onto the chair, but I only found a single floor-level vent near the door. It wasn't pointed anywhere near the corner. The porch felt normal that morning. The armchair looked the same, still moldy, still grimy. I touched the seat cushion, and it was cold. I decided to move it. I figured I would throw it out or leave it outside to dry. Maybe the weirdness would stop if I got rid of it. I leaned down and gripped the sides. When I tried lifting it, it felt solid, like it was filled with something heavier than foam. I could lift one corner, but the other side dragged like an anchor. Eventually, I managed to drag it across the porch floor. It made an awful scraping noise. I pulled it away from the corner, closer to the middle of the room. Then I pushed it near the door, intending to get it out that way. But the door's width was an issue. The chair's arms were too wide to pass through easily. I'd have to tilt it or turn it sideways. After struggling for a bit, I realized I needed a second pair of hands or I'd risk jamming it in the doorway. I was already sweating and out of breath. I decided I'd call a friend later in the week to help. For the time being, I left the armchair near the door and went back to my usual day. That evening, around the same time as before, I heard the squeaking again. It was softer but still noticeable if I stopped what I was doing and listened. I walked to the glass door and peered in. The chair was in the middle of the porch now, not near the wall. It looked as if it had rotated slightly, facing a different angle than I'd left it. I stared for a while, feeling a chill run down my arms. I told myself maybe I'd just forgotten the exact position, but I was certain I'd left it facing the opposite way. My hand was shaking a bit when I grabbed the door handle. I wanted to check if the sliding mechanism was locked. The handle felt cold. I slid the door open and stepped inside. The smell of dampness was stronger at night. I walked over to the chair and stood in front of it. My skin crawled. I half expected it to start moving on its own, but it didn't. It was still. The cushion looked undisturbed. I touched it again. This time it felt lukewarm. Not as warm as before, but definitely not as cold as the air around it. I moved my hand away quickly. I decided to push the chair all the way to the far end of the porch. I didn't like it near the door. It felt too close to my living space. I planted my hands on it and shoved it across the floor. It screeched again, making my ears ring. The whole time I pushed, it felt heavier than it looked. My muscles strained and my back started to ache. Finally, I got it against the far wall. It ended up almost where it originally was, except a few feet away from the corner. I took a breath, my heart pounding, and headed back inside, locking up. I tried to watch TV, but my mind wasn't on it. I kept glancing at the hallway. The house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Then, about half an hour later, the squeaking returned. It was a slow, rhythmic sound. I turned up the volume on the TV, but I could still hear it. My stomach twisted. I walked down the hall, turned on the porch light, and stared through the glass. I saw the chair rock forward slightly, then ease back like someone was adjusting their posture. I stopped breathing for a second. I didn't see anyone. There was no one there, just the chair moving in small, steady motions. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple. I wasn't sure if I should open the door again, but something compelled me to do it. I slid the door open slowly. The squeaking continued for a moment longer, then stopped. I stepped inside. My mouth felt dry. I couldn't see anything out of place except the chair's seat cushion was depressed again. I stood there holding my breath, waiting for something else to happen. After a long moment, I reached down and touched the fabric. It was warm. My skin broke out in goosebumps. A wave of panic swept through me. My hands began to tremble. I didn't want to stay there. I didn't want to touch that chair anymore. I backed away and went into the house, shutting and locking the door. I turned off the porch light but left the hallway light on. I hurried to my bedroom and closed the door. I spent the night tossing and turning. Every time I heard the smallest sound, I'd jolt awake. I felt edgy, like there was someone in the house. But I was alone. Eventually, I got up around 5 in the morning and made coffee. I stared at the hallway, thinking about what to do. I wanted that chair gone, but I also didn't want to deal with it by myself. Around midday, I called a friend to see if he could come over the next day and help me move the chair to the curb. He said yes. I spent the rest of the day avoiding the porch. I didn't hear any noises during daylight hours, which made me think maybe it was all in my head. But I knew the weight and warmth weren't imaginary. That night I was in bed around 11 when I heard the squeaking again, faint, but there. I pulled the covers up. My pulse pounded in my neck. The sound was steady, like gentle rocking. I tried to ignore it. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep. Finally, I got up, took my flashlight, and walked to the hallway. I stood there, my heart hammering. I could see the silhouette of the chair through the glass. It looked like it was shifting, but the shadows made it hard to tell. I walked away without opening the door. I barely slept. In the morning, my friend arrived. I told him about the chair, but I left out the weird details. I just said it creeped me out and I wanted it gone. He shrugged and said he'd help. We went to the porch and found the chair exactly where it had been. Together, we tried to move it out the door. It was still heavy, but with two people, we managed to tilt and maneuver it through the frame without too much trouble. It took a lot of grunting and pushing, but we got it to my driveway. The friend asked why the chair felt wet. He noticed his hands smelled musty afterward. I just said it was old and damp from the porch. We placed it next to the trash bins. He left. I went back inside, feeling a sense of relief. That evening, I kept checking the driveway. The chair was still there under the streetlight. The garbage pickup was scheduled for the next morning, so I figured that was the end of it. I went to bed around midnight. I was half asleep when I heard a noise in the backyard. It wasn't a squeak. It sounded like shuffling, like something dragging. My throat went tight. I sat up and listened. I heard a muffled scraping sound near the back porch door. The door rattled once. Then it stopped. I turned on the bedroom light, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and walked toward the hallway. I flicked on every light on my way. The porch was dark. I stood by the glass door, peering out. I couldn't see anything. Then a gust of wind rattled the windows, and I realized my mind might be playing tricks on me. I told myself the chair was outside by the curb. After a few minutes of standing there, I went back to my room and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I rushed outside to check if the garbage crew had taken the chair. I looked at the curb and saw nothing but a wet patch on the pavement. The chair was gone. I glanced up and down the street. There was no sign of it. I felt a mixture of relief and unease. Maybe someone picked it up before the garbage truck came, or maybe the truck actually came early. I never heard it, though. But I convinced myself it was gone for good. I walked back inside and made breakfast. For the first time in days, I felt almost normal. I thought, that's it, problem solved. But later that night, I was walking past the hallway, and I heard a short, distinct squeaking sound. I froze. It came from behind the glass door. I turned on the hallway light and looked through the door. It was too dark to see much. My skin prickled. I pressed my ear to the glass. It was quiet. I haven't heard the squeaking again, at least not clearly. But some nights when the house is silent, I think I catch a faint groan or shift on the porch. I check through the glass and see nothing. The space is empty. There's no furniture there now. Just the tiled floor and the windows. Yet sometimes I swear I hear that weight settling into the chair that isn't there anymore. And every time my stomach knots up, and I feel the urge to leave the hallway and lock my bedroom door, I keep telling myself it's in my head. But at night, I avoid looking too closely through the porch door. I can't shake the feeling that something might be sitting there, even though there's no chair left. No matter how many times I remind myself it's gone, I can't forget the heavy warmth I felt when I touched the cushion. I can't forget the slow rocking motion I saw. And I can't forget the squeaking sound that still seems to echo in the silence whenever I'm alone in the dark. I remember the first time I laid eyes on that pocket watch. My cousin handed it to me at the airport before he left for Europe. He placed it in my hand and said, "I don't want this anymore. It's been acting strange." I looked at him and shrugged. I didn't understand what he meant by strange. It was just an old pocket watch with a tarnished case and a chain that looked like it had seen better days. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and headed home without giving it much thought. Now I'm wishing I had left it with him instead. I'm not the kind of person who usually keeps track of antiques or old gadgets. I like modern stuff. I rely on my cell phone for the time. I don't wear a wristwatch, so the thought of carrying around a pocket watch never crossed my mind. Once I got home, I put the watch in my desk drawer. It had a small key for winding, but I didn't bother with it. I locked the drawer because I keep a few important papers there. Then I forgot about the watch for a few days. I had work to do, errands to run, and I didn't see any reason to think about an old watch. About a week later, I was sitting in my home office. It's a small room with a desk, a computer, and a bookshelf. I was typing out some emails, and I started hearing a soft ticking sound. At first, I thought it might be my desk clock, but I don't keep a desk clock. I only have a wall clock, and that thing makes a faint click every minute, not a steady tick. This was different. It was consistent. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded muffled, like it was coming from behind something. I stopped typing, listened carefully, and realized it seemed to come from my desk drawer. That confused me because the watch was in there, but I never wound it. Plus, I keep that drawer locked. I pulled out my keys, unlocked the drawer, and opened it. I saw the watch sitting there. The hands weren't moving. I picked it up. It felt cold and still. Yet I still heard a faint ticking in the room. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my skin prickle. I looked around the room, checked under the desk, checked behind my computer. Nothing else could be making that sound. I put the watch back in the drawer, closed it, and locked it again. The ticking stopped after that. I stood there for a while trying to figure out if maybe I was hearing things because of stress. Eventually, I sat back down, opened my emails again, and tried to forget it. 2 nights later, I got up around midnight to get a glass of water. My throat was dry and I couldn't sleep. I walked into the kitchen, flipped on the light, and poured myself some water from the filter pitcher. As I raised the glass to my lips, I heard that ticking again. It wasn't coming from my office this time. It seemed like it was coming from the living room. My entire body tensed up. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest. I set the glass on the countertop and stepped toward the living room entrance. My living room is connected to the kitchen by a short hallway. There's a small lamp on an end table near the sofa, but it wasn't on. The only light was from the kitchen behind me. When I entered the living room, I flipped the switch by the door. The overhead light is pretty harsh, so everything was suddenly very bright. That's when I saw the watch. It was sitting on my coffee table. The chain was coiled neatly beside it. I froze. There was no reason for the watch to be there. I kept it locked in my desk drawer. I could feel sweat on my forehead. My hands started shaking a bit. I tried to calm myself by taking a few slow breaths. It felt like my heart was beating too fast. I stared at the watch for a long moment. The ticking stopped. The watch looked just like before, with dull metal and a bit of tarnish around the edges. There was nothing obviously strange about it except for the fact it had moved on its own. I picked it up and felt its weight in my palm. The hands were still not moving. I listened for any ticking right against my ear, but I heard nothing. It felt like a chunk of metal, no different than a broken piece of hardware. I placed it back on the table, took a few steps back, and tried to understand what was happening. I went to my office and checked the drawer. It was still locked. I unlocked it and found the space empty. The watch wasn't there. I rubbed my temples. I thought maybe I had misplaced it, but I remember locking it away, and I know I didn't take it out. It didn't make sense. I went back to the living room and stared at it again. My legs felt shaky. I had this impulse to throw it away, but part of me wanted to hold on to it, like maybe I could figure out what was causing these strange events. I decided to put the watch in a metal box where I keep some old coins. That box has a little padlock on it. I placed the watch inside, locked it, and put the box in my closet. Then I double-checked the closet door. It has a simple latch, but I locked it from the inside anyway. I felt silly doing it, but I needed some sense of security. I went back to bed. I was tossing and turning, thinking about that watch, but I eventually fell asleep. I told myself I was probably just exhausted, maybe confusing dreams with reality. A few days later, I started feeling something else. These weird moments where I'd look at the time, get a sense of it, and then, when I checked again, far more time had passed than it should have. I'd open an email on my computer at 10:00 a.m., read it for what felt like 2 or 3 minutes, and then the clock on my screen would read 10:20 a.m. I'd think, did I zone out for 20 minutes? Or I'd be cooking breakfast, check the time on the oven, say 7:15 a.m., and by the time I served the food, the oven clock said 7:35 a.m., even though it seemed like only 5 minutes had gone by. At first, I blamed it on my own absent-mindedness. I work from home, so I can lose track of time. But it kept happening, and it made me uneasy. One afternoon, I decided to see if the watch had something to do with these time jumps. I went to my closet and took out the locked box. I unlocked it, and there was the watch. Still cold, still lifeless. I held it up to the light in my bedroom. The dial had faint cracks in it. The glass was slightly scratched. I reached for the small winding key I had kept in the same box. I considered winding it just to see if it worked, but I hesitated. I felt this immediate knot in my stomach. My mouth went dry. I set the watch on my dresser and stepped back, watching it like it might start ticking on its own. It stayed silent. I kept it on my dresser for a day or two. Nothing happened. No ticking, no strange movements, no time distortions that I could definitely link to it. But I kept noticing odd jumps on the wall clock in my office. It felt like I'd sit down to do a single task that should take 10 minutes and the clock would show half an hour gone. My heart would pound every time I noticed it. I started to worry about my health. I thought maybe I was having some kind of neurological issue. But I never felt sick, and I never got headaches or dizziness. I just lost time. One night, I decided to try something different. I took my phone and started a stopwatch app. I wanted to time myself doing a simple task, like writing a paragraph for work. I placed the phone next to my keyboard and kept an eye on it. It was about 8 p.m. I started writing, but I felt anxious. My mind wandered to that watch on my dresser in the other room. After a few lines, I glanced at the stopwatch. It read Oro 2.15, 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Then I heard a soft ticking from somewhere in the house. My body tensed up. I jumped out of my chair and ran to my bedroom. The watch was on the dresser, but I heard the ticking even louder in the hallway. It was that same consistent tick, tick, tick. I walked toward the bedroom. My scalp felt tingly, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. When I entered the bedroom, the watch wasn't on the dresser anymore. It was on the floor near the bed. The ticking was still going, and it sounded like it was coming right from the watch. But the hands weren't moving. I bent down, picked it up, and held it in my palm. The ticking stopped. I stared at it, waiting for something else to happen. My phone was still in the other room, so I had no idea how much time had passed. I rushed back to the office and checked the stopwatch. It showed 14:50. I felt my stomach drop. That was more than 12 minutes of difference from when I left my desk, and I was sure I hadn't spent more than a minute or two checking the bedroom. I tried to keep a clear head. I grabbed a notepad and wrote down the times I was seeing. I wrote, 8 p.m. started writing, 8:02:15 checked stopwatch, 8:14:50 returned. Then I tried to compare that with the wall clock. The wall clock read 8:14 p.m. My phone read 8:14 p.m. So the stopwatch was probably accurate, but it felt like only 2 minutes had passed for me, not 12. My hands were shaking so much I could barely write. I shut off my computer, locked the watch in the metal box again, and left it in the closet. I decided I'd try to forget about it for a while. For a few days I tried to keep myself busy. I avoided going into my bedroom unless I needed clothes or to sleep. I set up a cot in my office for quick naps during the day, so I could work without worrying about the watch. I felt stupid for letting an object control my behavior, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house felt tense. Every sound, every creak in the walls made me jumpy. I kept checking the locks on my closet door and the little padlock on the metal box. I kept my desk drawer locked too, even though I'd taken the watch out of there already. One evening, I was watching TV in the living room. It was around 9:30 p.m. The show was some random series about mechanics rebuilding old cars. I wasn't really focusing on it. I just wanted some background noise. Then I heard the ticking start up again. My whole body went stiff. I looked at the coffee table. The watch wasn't there. I checked under the couch cushions, under the table, nothing. The ticking got louder. It was coming from the hallway that led to my office. I turned off the TV, stood up, and walked slowly toward the hall. My heart was thumping so hard that I felt short of breath. I reached the office door and put my ear against it. The ticking was on the other side. I grabbed the handle and swung the door open. The lights were off, but there was enough ambient light from the living room to see inside. The watch was on my desk chair. My palms started sweating. I flicked on the overhead light and stared at it. The watch looked the same, dull metal, scratched face. The chain was draped over the back of the chair. I swallowed hard and stepped closer. The ticking continued, almost like it was mocking me. I reached out to grab the watch, but the moment my fingers touched it, the ticking stopped. I felt an intense chill sweep through my entire body. My mouth went completely dry. I could barely swallow. At that point, I decided I needed to get rid of it. I marched to the garage and found an old cardboard box. I stuffed the watch inside, taped it shut, and wrote junk on the side. I planned to drive to a thrift store and drop it off, but my nerves were so shot that I went back inside, drank a glass of water, and tried to calm down. I told myself I'd do it first thing in the morning. It was too late to go out, and the thrift store would be closed. I put the cardboard box in the corner of the garage. I made sure it was sealed tightly. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking I heard faint ticking sounds, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I pulled the blanket over my head like that would somehow protect me from my own fear. My muscles were tense, and my stomach felt knotted. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the watch in the living room or on my desk. I kept imagining it somehow finding its way back into my bedroom. But eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I rushed to the garage. The box was still in the corner, right where I left it. I exhaled with relief. I loaded it into my trunk, drove across town, and parked behind a thrift store that takes donations in a drop-off zone. I left the box on the donation shelf and got back in my car. I felt a wave of relief. I drove home and tried not to look back. I told myself it was over. If the watch wanted to roam around someone else's house, that was fine by me. I spent the rest of the day tidying up. I swept my floors, dusted my shelves, and even rearranged some furniture. I wanted to reclaim my home as a normal place. By evening, I felt calmer. I made dinner, watched some TV, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But I couldn't fully relax. I kept expecting that ticking noise to start again, or to discover the watch on my coffee table. I checked my locked drawer, my closet, and the metal box just to be sure everything was normal. They were all empty, just like I expected. After that, I tried to push the watch out of my mind. It's been a couple of days and I'm still on edge. Every so often I think I hear a faint tick, but it might just be my nerves. I'm still noticing these odd time jumps once in a while, but they're less intense now that the watch is gone. Maybe it was all in my head, and I just needed to distance myself from that strange object. Or maybe there was something about that watch that affected my perception of time. I don't know, and I'm trying not to overthink it. I just hope whoever ends up with that thing next doesn't experience the same unsettling moments I did. If they do, they'll probably wonder what's wrong with them. And if they ever trace it back to me, I won't have any good explanations. I'll just tell them the same thing my cousin told me. That watch is strange, and I didn't want it anymore. I moved into this ground floor apartment because I wanted privacy. The tall walls around my private patio looked perfect. I thought I had found my own little fortress. I never expected that the darkest corner of that outdoor space would keep me awake at night. I noticed the damp spot on my first day here. It was late afternoon and I stepped outside to take a quick look at the property lines. The walls were solid and tall, and the entire outdoor area was paved except for a narrow strip of dirt against one side. Everything looked decent except for a patch of dark mold in the far corner. That area didn't get any sunlight at all. The smell there was musty and thick. I didn't like it, but I just thought I'd deal with the mold later. I unpacked my moving boxes and figured I'd handle everything in time. I remember the first night. I sat in my living room going through some emails when I heard a soft thump coming from outside. I paused and listened. It sounded like a slow, dull tapping on the wall. It wasn't loud, and it felt like something was brushing or scratching from the other side of the concrete. The sound lasted for a few seconds, then stopped. I shrugged it off as outside noise or maybe a neighbor. It seemed silly to worry about it. But it happened again an hour later, just after midnight. It was a short sequence of knocks or scrapes, then silence. It raised the hairs on my arms because it sounded too close, like it came right from that damp corner. The next morning, I went outside to take a better look at that corner. The patch of mold had spread. It formed a dark, uneven pattern on the lower portion of the wall. I walked up to it, and a stale, chilly breeze brushed across my face. It felt like a draft, but there was no opening or vent. The walls were solid. I put my hand close to the surface. It was cold to the touch and droplets of moisture clung to the wall. I scraped it lightly with a flathead screwdriver I found in my toolbox. The mold came off in thin layers, leaving a slimy residue on the metal. I felt a little nauseous when I saw it. The spot made me uneasy, but it was just mold, so I told myself it was normal in a moist, shaded area. That evening, I placed a plastic garden chair in that corner, thinking I might try to block any weird drafts. I also wanted to see if it stayed damp underneath objects. I went to bed and slept okay until around 3 in the morning. Then I woke up to a faint scraping sound. I got out of bed, walked to the sliding glass door that leads to the patio, and peered outside. The night light in the patio area was faint, but I could see something that looked like motion near the corner. I froze. My heart pounded, and I felt my palms get sweaty. I stared for maybe 30 seconds. I didn't see anyone. I didn't see any animal either. The sound stopped. I stayed there for another minute, on edge, but eventually I went back to bed. In the morning, I checked the corner. The chair wasn't where I left it. It was 2 or 3 feet away from the wall, shifted to the side. There were faint scrape marks on the concrete like it had been dragged. It didn't look like wind damage. I tried pushing the chair around to see how easily it moved. It was pretty light, but the scrape marks suggested a deliberate movement. I didn't see footprints or signs of intrusion. The tall walls and locked gate made it unlikely that anyone was hopping inside. Still, it bothered me. I looked up at the sky and realized how shady that area was. The sun never reached it. The rest of the patio got at least a few hours of light during the day, but that corner stayed dim. I tried to calm myself by focusing on normal chores. I unpacked more boxes and assembled some furniture, yet I couldn't stop thinking about that moldy area. That day, I decided to scrub the wall and see if I could clean it thoroughly. I bought a bottle of mold remover, a stiff brush, and a face mask. The smell of the product mixed with the musty odor made me gag a bit. I spent about half an hour scrubbing the wall. The mold stained the brush, and the runoff was dark gray. After rinsing the wall, I saw that the stain remained. It was lighter, but it wouldn't come off completely. I decided to let it dry and try again another day. That night, I heard the scraping noises again. This time, it sounded like a single tap, a pause, then a slightly louder scratch. I walked to the sliding door and flipped on the exterior light. Nothing moved, but I heard the faint echo of something rubbing against the wall. I felt my heartbeat speed up again. I slid the door open just enough to step outside. The concrete was cold under my bare feet. I took a few steps toward the corner, feeling my chest tighten. A sudden chill blew past me from that direction. I stopped in my tracks. Everything was still. I stared at the wall and felt like something was off. The house next door was dark. The street was quiet. I didn't see or hear a person or an animal. I backed up and went inside, trying to stay calm. Once I locked the door, the sound stopped. The next morning, I found my bucket of cleaning supplies moved about a foot from where I left it. There were fresh scratch marks on the wall, small and shallow, as if someone had scraped the surface with a sharp object. I ran my finger over the marks. It felt rough. Tiny flecks of dried mold or maybe concrete dust stuck to my fingertip. I considered the possibility of an intruder. But how would they get in or out without me noticing? The gate was locked. The walls were tall. The building's main entrance was a long hallway away. I started feeling nervous about staying there alone at night. I decided to install a small security camera pointed directly at that corner. It was a simple setup. A Wi-Fi camera with motion detection and night vision, plus an SD card for local recording. I tested it by waving my hand around the corner. The footage looked clear. That night, I kept the camera on. I went to bed around midnight. I woke up just before 6 in the morning and checked the footage. The file ended around 3 in the morning with a corrupted video. The final minute or so was just garbled pixels, and then it cut off. The camera was still running, but the recording had stopped. I pulled the SD card and tried to view it on my laptop. Nothing. It was all static after a certain point. I had no explanation. The device itself didn't show signs of damage, but the data was useless. I tried again the following night, this time with a different memory card. The same thing happened. Corrupted files after a few hours. I even tried a third time, connecting the camera to a different power source, but the problem persisted. I didn't see a single clear frame of what happened past 2 or 3 in the morning. I started to wonder if there was some weird interference or maybe a fault in the camera. But it felt more personal than that. Every time I checked the corner, something was moved or knocked over. I spoke to my neighbor, a retired guy who lived upstairs. He said he never heard anything suspicious at night, and he'd never experienced problems with mold. He asked if maybe I had a rodent issue. I considered it. Could rats or some other animal be responsible? But I couldn't figure out how they could drag a chair or a bucket without leaving signs like droppings or gnaw marks. The neighbor suggested calling the landlord for a mold inspection, but I owned the apartment, so it was my responsibility. I called a professional mold remediation company for a quote. They told me they'd charge a lot to treat the wall with special chemicals and maybe install a dehumidifier in that corner. I made an appointment for the following week. Meanwhile, each night, the noises continued. It was always the same pattern, faint tapping or scraping, usually sometime after midnight. It never lasted more than a few minutes. Sometimes I'd try to ignore it, but I'd get out of bed anyway. I'd walk to the sliding glass door, look outside, and never see anything. When I built up enough courage to step out, the air near that corner felt heavy and cold. If I left anything in that corner, I'd find it moved slightly the next morning. One night, around 2 in the morning, I decided to approach the wall again. I had my phone's flashlight on, shining it directly at the mold patch. The mold looked thicker than before, and the shape of it was uneven. The smell was awful. When I got closer, I thought I saw a faint ripple in the texture, as though the mold was moving. I blinked, stepped forward, and looked again. Up close, it was just wet patches on the concrete. But something about the surface made me shiver. It looked like dozens of tiny pores, each oozing moisture. My stomach churned. I stepped back. Right then, my phone's flashlight flickered for a second. It never did that before. The battery was full. My phone had no damage. But the light flickered again, then went steady. I turned around and walked straight back inside. I shut the door and locked it. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that mold creeping across the wall. I pictured it spreading over the patio floor, inch by inch, or seeping under the door. My rational mind told me this was just a fungus in a damp corner, but my instincts were screaming at me that something else was going on. My chest felt tight. I was breathing faster than normal. I forced myself to lie down and calm my heart rate. It felt like hours before I fell asleep. By the time the mold remediation team arrived, I was exhausted. 2 guys in uniform showed up with equipment. A chemical sprayer, protective gear, and a large industrial fan. They took one look at the corner and said it was a pretty bad infestation. I stepped aside and let them do their job. They scraped off a lot of the mold, applied a heavy-duty cleaner, and then used a fan to help dry out the area. They left after about an hour, telling me to keep an eye on it and let them know if it came back. They also said I might need better ventilation in the patio, but it was basically an enclosed space, so options were limited. That night, I went to bed feeling more optimistic. The wall looked cleaner. The smell wasn't as bad. I actually slept until nearly 5 in the morning without interruption. Then I heard it again, a series of soft taps. I jumped out of bed, raced to the patio door, and turned on the light. The mold wasn't fully gone. A fresh patch was already creeping across the base of the wall. The air felt cold again. I stepped outside cautiously. My bare feet touched damp concrete. The humidity in that corner was back. I watched droplets of moisture forming along the newly cleaned surface. I stood there for a minute, listening for movement. Nothing else happened. The tapping had stopped as soon as I opened the door. In the morning, I checked the camera footage. Corrupted again, right around the same time. I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. I started to doubt myself. Was I imagining things? Was my camera defective? I tried a different brand of camera, but the results stayed the same. Corrupted recordings after a few hours. No clear explanation. I considered sleeping in the living room with the sliding door open just to keep an eye on that corner. But the thought of staring at that dark patch all night made my skin crawl. Instead, I tried to come up with a plan. First, I bought a motion-activated floodlight. I installed it on the patio ceiling so it would shine directly at the corner. If anything moved there at night, it would trigger a bright light. Setting it up took me a couple of hours. I tested it in the evening by waving my hand in the corner. It worked. A sudden beam of light illuminated the wall. Around 1 in the morning, I was still awake, scrolling on my phone, when I heard a pop from outside. Then the floodlight clicked on. I jumped up, grabbed a metal flashlight, and hurried to the sliding door. The floodlight was shining, but I didn't see movement. I opened the door and stepped out. The corner was lit up, and the mold glistened like black slime on the wall. The air stank of mildew. I looked around, walked up to the wall, and found nothing. No intruder. No animal. I stood there, feeling my heart race, listening. The floodlight turned off after a minute because there was no motion to keep it activated. I stood in the dark, only my flashlight shining on the damp wall. I heard a quiet sound behind me like a raspy exhale. I spun around. The air was still. I saw no one, no thing. I backed away toward the door, refusing to turn my back on that corner. Then I went inside and locked the door. I could still feel my pulse thumping in my neck. Over the next few weeks, I tried everything. I used different cleaning solutions, placed a few dehumidifier packets in the corner, and even left a fan running outside. Nothing solved the moisture problem. The mold kept returning. Every few nights, I'd hear that tapping or scratching sound. Every few nights, something got moved in the corner. The camera kept failing to record. My neighbor upstairs stayed clueless. He claimed not to hear a thing. I called an electrician to check if there was some wiring behind the wall that could cause interference. There wasn't. The walls were just plain concrete. I had the plumber check for leaks. He didn't find any pipe issues. I started to dread nighttime. I stayed up late, wide awake in bed, waiting for the tapping. It never happened at the same time. Sometimes it was around midnight, sometimes as late as 3 or 4. But it always sounded the same, like a slow, deliberate tapping from the other side of the wall, followed by a faint scratching. My chest would tighten, and I'd feel cold sweat on my forehead. I couldn't relax. My mind raced with thoughts about something lurking out there. Each time I mustered the courage to step outside, the noise stopped. Every time I tried to catch it on camera, the footage got corrupted. At one point, I even considered selling the apartment. The idea of living with this bizarre, unsolved problem weighed on me. But I had just bought the place. The real estate market wasn't great, and I didn't want to explain to a potential buyer that there was something strange in the corner of the patio. So I stayed. I tried to keep things normal. I went to work, I cooked dinner, I watched TV, I scrolled through my phone. But my mind never fully let go of that nagging sense of unease. One night, I decided to sit by the sliding glass door in the dark and just watch. My plan was to wait for the tapping, then flick on the floodlight manually. I sat there with a glass of water, breathing slowly, trying to stay calm. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the first faint tap. My heart pounded. I held my breath and listened. Another tap, then something like a scratch or a drag. I flipped the switch for the floodlight and pressed my face to the glass. The corner lit up, and I saw a slight movement across the wall. It was like the surface rippled, but maybe it was just water trickling down. I couldn't be sure. I stared for a good 20 seconds. The movement didn't repeat. My face was only inches from the glass, and I felt a sense of panic. That corner looked wet, but nothing else was there. When the tapping stopped, I realized my hands were shaking. My mouth was dry. I was breathing heavily, and my chest felt tight. I sat there for a few more minutes before finally stepping away. I didn't sleep much that night. I live with this routine now. The mold is still there, no matter how many times I clean it. The camera keeps failing at night. The tapping and scraping continue. I keep hoping to catch someone sneaking in, but there's never anyone there. Sometimes I see fresh scratch marks on the concrete. Other times I find random objects moved around. I even tried leaving a big, heavy plant pot in that corner, thinking it would be too heavy to move. One morning I found it shifted an inch away from the wall. I can't say I've solved anything. I haven't seen a ghost or a person. I haven't found a physical explanation. All I know is that the corner is always damp and cold, and at night, something happens there. I've tried to act tough about it, but it gets under my skin. Every time I hear that tapping, my heart jumps. Every time I see something moved, my stomach drops. So that's where things stand. I own this place. I can't afford to leave. I don't have any proof that something is actively breaking in, but I also don't have a normal explanation for these events. The mold remediation team said they might have to tear out a portion of the wall to really address the moisture source. That means more time, more money, and no guarantee it'll fix the strange night activity. But I might do it anyway, just to see if something is hidden behind the wall. For now, I stay alert. I've got my floodlight, my camera, and my flashlight. I keep my phone charged in case I need to record anything. I try to tell myself it's probably just a weird moisture problem combined with my imagination, but deep down I don't really believe that. I can't deny the things I've seen with my own eyes and heard with my own ears. Tonight I'm going to try something new. I'm going to set my phone on a tripod, point it at that corner through the sliding glass door, and record straight to my cloud storage. If that fails too, I'll have to accept that there's something out there I can't explain. Either way, I'll keep trying to figure it out. I'll keep facing that dark, damp spot. I can't pretend it's not there. Whether it's mold or something worse, I'm living with it in my own backyard. If I ever get answers, I'll make sure to tell someone. But right now, I'm still in the dark, listening to those quiet taps on the other side of the wall.